Section 24 of By Beach and Bog-Land, Some Irish Stories by Jane Barlow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Two Pair of Truants, Part 2. About this time, Tom Flannery was digging in his potato patch at the fork of the Letteresque and Glasdrum roads. Fay now, but Lizzie Hackett's in a fine hurry. Whatever ails her, he said to himself, as he became aware of a young woman trotting along the dyke. "Where at all are you taken off with yourself to?" he shouted, as soon as she was near enough, and Lizzie shouted back across the low stone wall, "Sure they're in great distraction above at the lodge. The two childer's lost. They went out this mornin' early, but a while ago the schoolmistress looked in wid word they'd niver been next or nigh her. Stole they are by them tinkers, I'll bet you anythin', and their poor mother away at the fair, and the old woman shakin' in her chair, fit to trimble the house down on her head. But runnin' up to Connolly's farm I am, for Minnie and babies went there a few times along wid me, and it's mostly the only place they know their way to hereabouts. You didn't be chance see them goin' by this mornin'?" "Sorra a stim this mornin' nor that mornin'," said Tom. "But if they're strayed or stole, you'd a right to lave word with the police." "Och, lave word with them yourself," Lizzie said, setting off again, partly because she never liked taking advice, and partly because she did not now wish to lengthen her hot race by calling at the barracks. Tom rejoined, "Bedad, I've something else to do, me dear." But when, by and by, he finished his job, he turned a bit out of his homeward way that he might pass the police station. Sergeant Corey was looking over the arched gate into the road. "Dry weather, Sergeant, when it isn't wet," said Tom. "Did you hear tell anything of two children bein' lost?" "What sort of childer now?" said the sergeant. "Well, I don't know very rightly," said Tom. "I never seen them, but they're out of the lodge over there at the castle entrance, and old Mrs. Lawler's expectin' her death wid the fright. A little girl and a baby, I think, they said." "Sure enough, they answer to that description, the two I have inside here. The small one's no size to spake of, and the other's a girl, though she hasn't got the gift of the gab yet. I'll send them over to the lodge with Doyle and Atkinson, that's about settin' off patrolin'. It'll be a good job to get them shifted into their own quarters before night." To the lodge, accordingly, two tall constables carried the little Tiernays, encountering by the way a fierce shower which twisted Biddy's black locks into dripping rats' tails, and soaked Peter's fluff of fair hair till it shrunk into nothing, like a wisp of wet thistledown. Their arrival caused bitter disappointment to Mrs. Lawler, Jr., who had lately returned to her despoiled home. She vehemently declared the forlorn-looking bundles to be no children of hers, nor anyways like them, and was disposed to resent the constable's conjecture that Minnie and baby had just run off for diversion with some of their schoolfellows to the fair. However, she consented to keep these strange children while a search was being made, and she beguiled her suspense by getting them into dry garments outgrown by the probable victims of tinkers and tramps. Meanwhile, Minnie and Baby had in reality been experiencing many vicissitudes. At first, all had gone fairly well with them. After some roaming, they had emerged from the shrubberies onto a sloping lawn, whence they had a grand view of the castle with its turrets and towers. It pleased them so much that they sat down on a bench beneath a big sycamore to enjoy the prospect and their oranges. This was the highest point of their success, for when they had just finishing peeling, and the grass all around them was thickly strewn with shreds of white-lined golden rind, suddenly there appeared to them an elderly, angry man in a straw hat, who wanted to know what they meant by trespassing on his grounds, and bade them clear up that disgraceful litter at once, and stood pointing his stick and glaring dreadfully at every single scrap of peel until it was picked up, and then, as they fled away like scared rabbits, shouted that he would give notice to the police to keep an eye on them. Thenceforward troubles gathered and gloom. When they escaped from the labyrinth of shrubberies, they found themselves in strange fields, where they met with herds of what were certainly beasts, and, in Minnie's opinion, most likely bulls. They were hunted out of a rickyard by a barking dog, and in their flight Baby lost a shoe, which they dared not turn back to discover. Soon afterwards she ran a thorn into her unshod foot, and could hardly hobble along. It came on to rain so heavily that their new hats were battered and drenched out of all shape and hue, and Minnie tore a sleeve of her good jacket into ribbons, scrambling through a hedge. As time elapsed, they felt more and more thoroughly lost, and their terrors were increased by a dread that all the while they might perhaps be trespassers with the eye of the police upon them. But at last, when they had almost despaired of ever, as Baby said, being anywhere again, as they stumbled along the edge of a ploughed field, they were met by a big boy carrying a bunch of bright tinware. Minnie had luckily still sense enough left to explain that they were looking for a gate lodge of the castle, upon hearing which the boy just caught each of them by an arm and swung them through a gap in the ragged hedge, setting them down plump in the middle of a muddy lane. Sure, there's one within a couple of stones' throws off you, only you was heading the wrong way to get to it, he said, pointing along the lane. Them's the gate-posts glimpsing at you out of the trees. And the children perceived with relief and amazement that so it actually was. Full of joy and confidence, they started again, but before they had gone many steps, they met Lizzie Hackett setting out to see if there were any signs of constables, coming back with news of what, in her own mind, she called them young torments. "Saints and patience," she said when she saw them, "and so there you are. I declare to goodness I thought it was a couple of beggar childer coming along. You're that quare shows. Where in the earthly world have you been the whole day?" "We just took a bit of a walk like," Minnie said, beginning to feel that their difficulties might not yet be all at an end. "Well, to be sure, a fine bit of a walk," said Lizzie, "wid your poor granny and your poor ma terrified out of their 7 senses, and meself kilt stravadin' over the parish after you. A race is running on you for a couple of as bold childer as there is in Ireland." Lizzie, being out of humour with everybody, preferred the chance of paying out the Truants for the trouble they had caused her to the excitement of announcing their return, so she continued, "Howsome'er, you've no call to be hurrying yourselves now. You can be stopping away as long as you plaze, and longer after that again, for your ma says she won't be bothered any more to put up with the likes of such ungovernable brats, and she's got herself a couple of nice good little childer to keep that won't be annoying her losing themselves about the country instead of going to their school. And she's after dressing them illigant in the cloth cape that was belonging to you, Miss Minnie, and a one of baby's cotton frocks, and the 2 of them sitting this minute as grand as anything at all before the fire in the parlour. Petting them finely herself is, and not thinking a thraneen of yous. It's in your beds that them ones'll be sleeping this night, but sure you'd rather be tearing about under the rain in the fields like the rabbits," said Lizzie, pulling her shawl over her head and walking on. "And at pitch dark," she added over her shoulder. If Minnie had been in her ordinary frame of mind, she would have perceived how improbable this story sounded, and would have said to baby, "Och, never mind, she's only romancing." Just then, however, she was too tired and bewildered to take a sensible view of anything, and what Lizzie asserted alarmed and enraged them both. Still, they more than half hoped that they would find it was not true at all. But as they trotted and hobbled past the parlour window, they got a glimpse into the fire-lit room, and there, sure enough, 2 horrid little children were seated before the hearth, one wearing a pink frock, the other Minnie's well-known brown cape. And he, which was the worst part of it, sat on Minnie's mother's knee with a bitten biscuit in his hand. "'Deed, she has really got them," Minnie said to baby with a sort of groan. "There's no good in us going in any more." And both the little girls flung themselves down on a mossy log which had been made into a seat beneath an old laurel bush near the door. They had not noticed the sound of footsteps that were following them, but just then 2 figures came rushing by and darted into the house. In the parlour, Mrs. Lawler heard the patter of feet, which she had been listening for so long, and she jumped up very quickly, only to meet with another disappointment. Mick and Rosanna Tierney had enjoyed their time at the fair. They saw 2 shows and bought as many sweets as possible with their remaining pennies. They were careful not to meet their mother, nor did they forget how desirable it was that they should be at home again before her. The heavy rain, too, made it easier for them to tear themselves away from among the stalls and booths and carts and set off across the bog to pick up Biddy and Peter at the barracks. Rosanna had 3 fruit drops and half a peppermint sugar stick tied up for them in a corner of her wet pinafore. Mick had meant to bring Biddy a bullseye, but he put it into his mouth just to taste, and forgot to take it out until it was too late. At the police barracks, the rain had driven Sergeant Corey indoors, but he came out when he heard the children clattering into the porch. "If you please, sir," Mick said, panting, "we want the couple of childer we lost, here this morning going to Killavin. A little one and a bigger little girl, dark hair she has, the same as her." "They've straw hats on them," Rosanna struck in, "and the youngster has a grey flannen frock, and Biddy's is blue, and she's black stockings. She wouldn't tell you her name, or say anything only yis. Them's the very 2 we had here, till a while ago I packed them off to Mrs. Lawler up there at the Castle Lodge." "Bedad," said the sergeant, "it's the wrong children I'm after sending her. And what do you mean, I should like to know, by leaving them crawling about here and giving trouble and annoyance?" But the Tierneys were not waiting to listen. "Come along, Rosanna," said Mick. "We might be in time to get them yet if we hurry." And they did hurry with an impetuosity which brought them head foremost into the Lawlers' kitchen. "What brings you here at all?" poor Mrs. Lawler said, in much vexation, when she saw who they were not. "It seems to me every strange child in the parish is taking upon itself to come tumbling in on top of us, except me own little girls, and the dear knows where they may be." "We was only wanting to fetch away our 2, said Mick. "The sergeant sent you the wrong childer. That's Peter you've got, ma'am. Och, and there's Biddy. You take hold of her, Rosanna. I've took him. And I seen a couple of little girls sitting roaring on the sate there next door, and we running in. That might be your ones, ma'am." Out sped Mrs. Lawler, hopeful again, and this time not in vain. "Children dear, what happened to you at all?" she said, "and where have you been?" "We got into an old donkey cart," Minnie said deplorably, "and then we lost our ways, and an old man's after setting the police to keep an eye on us, and baby's one shoe is off her, and so the other one's no good, and she's run a thorn into her foot, and I've tore the cuff off of me sleeve, and our hats is destroyed. But we thought there wasn't any use going in, for Lizzie told us you'd took them other ones instead." "A donkey cart," said Mrs. Lawler. "I always said those thieves of tinkers were at the bottom of it. But come in, me jewels. Sure you're drowned and perished. The police ought to be ashamed of theirselves for not minding their business better." And in Mrs. Lawler's mind, indeed, the blame was permanently shared by the tinkers and the police, which was of course convenient for her children, and probably did not in any way affect either the police or the tinkers. As for the young Tierneys, they got home with such guilty expedition that they were all discovered innocently safe and dry by their own fireside when Mrs. Tierney returned with sugar sticks from the fair. And thus we must fear that the episode ended in a lamentable failure of poetical justice to all parties concerned. End of section 24, read by GERALD MOE, Tucker, Georgia. Section 25 of By Beach and Bog-Land, Some Irish Stories by Jane Barlow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Their New Umbrellas, Part 1. One blustering March afternoon, Mrs. Mooney looked in at Thomas Cantillin's to fetch a boot he was stitching for her, and there she found her neighbour, Mrs. Doyle, halfway through a story. I thought 'twas headlong into the deep gripe 'twould land me before ever it stopped, Mrs. Doyle was relating, for the tugging and pulling of it was more than I could contend with. You'd a right to let it go altogether sooner than that, ma'am, said old Thomas, considerin' the pair of you'd be very apt to ha' stead there once you got in. 'Deed now, maybe I might as well anyway, said Mrs. Doyle, for I question will I e'er get a day's work out of it again. Every bone in its unlucky body that isn't broke seems to be twisted and crooked and strained like. And what basty at all was it you were trying to control, ma'am? Inquired Mrs. Mooney. If it was that ugly-tempered mule of Kelly's, you're the foolish woman to make an offer at it. Sure, it's as much as me own Tony himself can do to manage the ungovernable crother. Mules, said Mrs. Doyle, what talk had anybody of them? Sure, I was tellin' Mr. Cantillin the way me umbrella got destroyed on me yesterday, comin' home from Mass in the storm. The wind took a holt on it the instant I come out on the straight road, and had it next door to wrenched out of me hand, and then inside out it blew itself on me with a flap you might aisy hear in the city of Cork, and only for Dinny running up and rachin' it down for me out of the sky, you might say, the dear knows where the either of us 'ud be this minute. But look at the object it is now. I misdoubt will it ever be fit for anything again, unless scaring the crows. The umbrella did certainly appear much the worse for its recent unequal struggle. It was stuck helplessly half open, bent ribs thrust themselves through jagged rents in its weather-stained cover, a menacing crack ran up its varnished yellow stick. Mr. Cantillin, who makes boots and mends miscellaneous property for Killimena, shook his head over this new patient long enough to emphasize the extremely skillful treatment which its case would require, and then he said, "Ah, sure, ma'am, I'll put some sort of a shape on it for you, ma'am, one way or another, though it'll be a ticklish job, and I wouldn't like to promise you that it'll present a very handsome appearance. But just for to be usin', I wouldn't wonder if it was as good as new." "That's more than ever it was within my recollection then," said Mrs. Mooney. "Darned it was, and the handle chipped ever since as long back as when old Fergus Doyle did be owning it." "Aye, did he bedad. Our family always kep an umbrella," said Mrs. Doyle. as an umbrella is kept by several of the most respected families in Killimena, umbrellaless Mrs. Mooney naturally surmised an innuendo in this statement, and hastened to rejoin, "Well, if it was me, I'd liefer get a drop of wet now and again than streel about holding up an old flitterin' jig that'd have people laughing at me behind me back, and I consating meself a great one all the while. I'd as soon put me head in a rag bag be way of a shawl." "Sure, then, it's well to be you, ma'am, that's so content the way you're like to stop," Mrs. Doyle said, just a shade, perhaps, over politely. "See you here, Mrs. Mooney, I've got your repairs done," said Thomas Cantillon, preventing a repartee by the production of Mrs. Mooney's boot from behind his chair. "You're after patching it," she said, examining it with a lengthened face. "I thought a stitch was all it wanted. But in course a man must keep his trade going. That'll be a penny more on me, I suppose, now." "Och, keep your pennies and tuppennies, ma'am," said Thomas. "Me trade's not so slack that I've any need to be stirring it up wid clapping on extry patches. You can pay me the next penny that tumbles down your chimney, and so can Mrs. Doyle for her umbrella that I'll have regulated again next Sunday." So Mrs. Doyle and Mrs. Mooney pointedly wished Mr. Cantillon good evening, and wished one another nothing good or bad, at least not audibly, as they departed in opposite directions. A sort of rivalry had long existed between Mrs. Doyle and Mrs. Mooney. It had begun when the simultaneous drowning of their fishermen husbands left each of them a young widow with one small baby, and it had gone on till now, when these infants had grown to man's estate. They were, in fact, the central subject of the rivalry. At first, indeed, this had seemed hardly possible to anybody except Mrs. Mooney herself, Mrs. Doyle's little Dinny being so obviously a much bigger and better-tempered baby than her own little Tony, who was weakly and fretful. As time went on, however, not only did Tony's health improve, but he developed a quickness of wits and capacity for book learning which could be set against Dinny's superior size and his prowess at all manner of athletic pursuits. Mrs. Mooney, when hostilely critical, called Dinny Doyle a big oaf, while Mrs. Doyle spoke of Tony Mooney as that quare little shrimp. The two boys had lived on fairly friendly terms from 3 years old to 20, and now that they were to see something of the world beyond Killimena, they rejoiced at being able to do so in company. For they were just setting off to the city of Cork, a vast distance away, where Dinny had got employment on a little pleasure boat which rowed visitors to the exhibition short lengths up and down the pretty River Lee, and Tony was to keep accounts in a restaurant near the entrance gate. Sir Gerald Vane Montfort had spoken for them to the executive committee, and hence these situations, the emoluments of which seemed splendidly liberal. So when Mrs. Mooney related with indignant inaccuracy at supper-time how Mrs. Doyle had been giving her impudence about not owning an old rag of an umbrella, Tony did not hesitate to promise her that he would bring her home the grandest umbrella in the parish. And on this same evening likewise, when Mrs. Doyle doubted mournfully whether Mr. Cantillon would ever contrive to splice the cracked handle, Dinny confidently bade her never mind, for she should have the best umbrella he could get in the city of Cork. Mrs. Mooney said that Tony would find plenty of things to be spending his money on besides his old mother, and Mrs. Doyle said that Dinny had a right to be saving all he could towards the rent and the seed potatoes and his suit of clothes, but notwithstanding their protests, both women thought a great deal of these promises. On the grey morning of the lad's departure, Mrs. Mooney said to her son, I wouldn't mind betting even sixpences that you'll never have the notion of an umbrella in your head from this minute till you're stepping on to the platform here again. But sure, 'twill be a good day whether or no. Mrs. Doyle was less outspoken. Still, as they waited for the train, she could not forbear saying, I declare to goodness, Dinny, the little shiny hole in the cloud there behind Loughlin's house is the very moral of the shape of the biggest tear in me old wreck of an umbrella. Spring, summer, and autumn passed by. The season's flowers had budded, blown, and faded, and the Cork exhibition, a brilliant artificial blossom, was to vanish like the rest. Consequently, Dinny Doyle and Tony Mooney were returning to Killimena. They had experienced an eventful and memorable time, but were not, on the whole, sorry to have done with it. Dinny was rather tired of watching the little boats slide up and down the water chute and flounder into the stream amid a flurry of shrieks and splashes. The clatter of plates and glasses, mingled with the strains of a military band, had begun to pall upon Tony in his office box. And though in out-of-work hours sights and diversions were bewilderingly abundant, the homely features of quiet little Killimena seemed to both of them just then a more alluring prospect. Tony, it is true, was planning to leave it again soon for good, having heard of a situation near the city whither he would, if possible, persuade his mother to move, but Dinny looked forward to resuming his place in Mick Devlin's fishing boat, and felt that it would be a pleasant thing once more to sit behind a tugging sail in an ocean-odorous breeze and to haul at a fishing net. There's more raisin and sense in that, after all, he concluded, than in paddling about with people that might as well be a flock of demented seagulls, according to that foolish gabbin they have out of them. It was thus that, in captious moods, he characterized the conversation of his passengers. And they holdin' up them little frilly-flouncy affairs over their quare big hats, sunshades, musha cock them up. It's the illigant wisps they'd be if there come a sup of rain, he often added disdainfully. But then the far more effectual shelter that he was going to provide for his mother's shawled head generally occurred to him, and always restored his good humour. Tony also bethought him from time to time of his promise, but he found the recollection less soothing. The two youths met on a platform of the labyrinthine-lined Cork railway terminus, and waited the tardy coming of their train, seated on a bench beneath a lurid advertisement of coffee essence. They piled their baggage in a small heap between them, and kept upon it vigilant eyes, especially on two long, slender, brown-papered parcels. Dinny, indeed, felt more secure when his was in his own hand. "I see you're bringing an umbrella, too," Tony said, referring to this. "I've got me mother's there. It was in a little shop on the coal quay, a good plain one it is. Bedad now, I might as well stop away as come back without it, she's that set on a one." "I seen this in a shop windy in the main street a while ago," said Dinny, "and I've been wondering would I have the price of it saved in time. 'Twas only yisterday I had be good luck. There was ne'er another in it that I liked the appearance of as well. The girl selling them said 'twas gentleman's size, and I'd better take a lady's one that'd come something chaper, but says I to her, me mother was as good as any gentleman ever stepped, and I wouldn't put her off with a skimpy size for the sake of a half-crown when I had it in me pocket. Real tasty the handle is, and they say the mischief himself couldn't blow it wrong side out. The frame's guaranteed." End of section 25. Read by GERALD MOE, Tucker, Georgia. Section 26 of By Beach and Bog-Land, Some Irish Stories by Jane Barlow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Their New Umbrellas, Part 2. "Gentleman's size might be apt to be a thrifle heavy and clumsy like for her to be carryin'," Tony said hopefully. "Divil a bit of it," said Dinny. "Me mother's a strong woman yet, glory be to God. Just weigh it in your hand, or stop a minute, I'll strip the paper off it and show you." Dinny unfastened the knotted twine with deft sailor's fingers, and drew the slim, dark green umbrella out of its shiny black case. The sleek folds were furled with wonderful symmetry about a polished cherry-wood stick, which ended in a richly carved knob studded with burnished stars. A silver band further adorned it, and a twining shamrock spray, while a long flossy tassel floated with a finishing touch of elegance. "I won't hoist it up," he said, "for I fear I mightn't get it rolled again as smooth as they done it in the shop, but you can see by the feel of it that it's rail strong silk. Twilled it is." He was so absorbed in the proud pleasure of displaying and repacking his purchase that he did not observe how Tony's countenance had fallen, and he looked up from his knot-tying with amazement at the tragical tones which burst forth. "Silk, bedad," Tony said bitterly. "Troth, it is that. And the handle bates everything. She won't look at mine, that's sartain, for it's as plain, and only black alpacky it is, or some other common old stuff. The man said it was good wear, but when she sees it alongside of silk, och, murder, what did that one stand you in now?" 17 and 6, said Dinny, "and mine I gave 5 shillings for, and me with a florin a week more than you. I might as well be slinging it under the next train passes. There's the whole of it. Sorra the ha'porth of use there is bringing it home to her, for it's only annoyed she'd be. But ne'er another penny I had to spend on it, what with this thing and that." Tony thrust his hands into his pockets, and with his eyes fixed gloomily on the toes of his brogues, and his shoulders shrugged up to his ears, sat moodily recalling the circumstances amid which his wages had so insidiously melted away. In the retrospect, his proceedings looked silly enough. The tempting side shows of the exhibition, the rifle ranges, bars, and refreshment rooms had accounted for many small coins. Others had been swallowed to even less profit by the penny-in-the-slot fortune-telling machines, which were stuck like snails all over the walls of the exhibition buildings, or had gone for slides down the switchback and water-chute. He was feeling thoroughly disgusted with himself and his investments when Dinny pulled him by the sleeve. "Look here," he said, "aren't you and your mother about quitting out of Killimena for good next week?" "We are so if she'll be ruled by me," said Tony, "but divil a bit of me knows what misliking she may take against it now if she's disappointed over the plain umbrella." "Well, then," said Dinny, "I'll try can I contrive so that me mother won't be using hers till the Sunday after, the way your mother won't be put out of conceit with that one. She'll like it well, no fear, so long as she doesn't get the notion that another's grander. Mind you, I dunno will I be able, for me mother'll be dead set on taking it to mass tomorrow, but I'll do me endeavours. I might manage to mislay it, that wouldn't be a bad plan." Yet while he proposed it, Dinny felt that he was despoiling his return of perhaps its most triumphant moment, and Tony, not unaware of this, said with appreciation, "Yourself's the dacent man." The circumstances which attended their homecoming seemed to favour Dinny's design, for the night was so dark when they reached Killimena that the two women waiting at the dimly lit station could barely see their sons, let alone take stock of bundles and parcels. Dinny got his baggage into his little nook of a room and stowed away the dangerous package unseen quite successfully. All supper-time he was expecting his mother to ask some question about her promised present, but she never did, though she threw out several hints that it went to his heart to ignore. But when she had wished him good night, and he was standing, the long parcel in his hand, considering whether he could find it a safer hiding-place, she suddenly slipped in again, just for the enjoyment of another look and word, and beholding, could not forbear an exclamation. "Glory be to goodness, so you brought it after all. I was thinking you maybe forgot it, unless you was only intending to not give it to me till we're just setting off to mass tomorrow." Dinny saw, accordingly, that there was nothing for it but to explain the matter fully, and, if possible, secure her cooperation. He stated the case as strongly as he could, enlarging upon the immensely superior quality and cost of this umbrella, and the extreme ill nature of making poor Mrs. Mooney think badly of her one, which was the best that Tony could afford. His eulogium was judiciously vague, because he apprehended that a detailed description, much more a glimpse of the ornate handle and sheeny green folds, would render his mother's impatience to be showing them off altogether intolerant of postponement. It was not easy, even so, to prevail upon her, for memories of taunting speeches rankled to strengthen her contention that she had no call to be putting herself about to please Judy Mooney, set her up. However, he at length obtained her consent to lay aside the unopened parcel until tomorrow week, and he created a temporary diversion by producing a little scarlet volume out of which trailed a long and wonderful series of highly glazed landscapes. Next morning was, rather unluckily, just the weather for a new umbrella. Drizzly showers and no wind to threaten a precious novelty with rough usage. Nevertheless, Dinny got his mother safely off to 11 o'clock Mass under her old battered gingham, her dissatisfaction with which he sought to mitigate by holding it over her himself. He hoped that they would not fall in with the Mooneys, for he dreaded the effect which the actual sight of her neighbour's glory might have upon his mother's tongue. But when they were near the chapel door, he saw what almost startled his own into unruliness. For a few yards in front of them paced Mrs. Mooney, proudly holding up the very moral of his grand green silk umbrella. Nay, it was the identical same one, and no other. He espied the silver shamrocks shining as she furled it in the porch. Tony must have taken the wrong parcel last night by accident in the dark, or else he'd done it on purpose, the villain. His outrageous conduct in keeping it made that seem highly probable, and he certainly had a guilty air as he followed his exultant mother to their seat. Dinny determined to have it out with the thief of the world the instant service was done, and he sat irefully longing for that instant to arrive. The congregation at last broke up, and as they stepped out, Mrs. Doyle bade Dinny take a hold of the old umbrella for her, because her 2 hands would be full trying to keep her skirts from the mud. She might have added truthfully that she wished to detain her handsome son at her elbow, and, having accomplished this, she said complacently, "Mercy on us, Dinny, Vic, did you see the show poor Mrs. Mooney's after making of herself? In such a hurry she was to be sticking up her gazabo of a new umbrella, she'd scarce wait till she was clear of the door, but took and nearly prodded the eye out of young Barney Laughlin, whirling it up in the face of him. The woman might have more wit, and it's not raining a drop then either. It's only beginning again this minute. And, child dear, but I'm glad it's a different sort of a one you brought me, for I couldn't abide the thoughts of that queer-looking yoke at all. It's twiced too big for one thing, and them outlandish cockasinas stuck on the handle has an odious, ugly appearance. Rail comical. I never seen anybody with them. I should suppose them little gimcracks do be very chape. And tellin' you the truth, I always had a great wish for a black umbrella. black the one at home is, anyway," said Dinny, looking somewhat disconcerted, "and as plain. "Well now, Alana, that's a good hearin'," said Mrs. Doyle. "Black's the very best colour it could be. It's that dacent at a buryin'. Frettin' in me own mind I was, thinking you might bring me a brown or a green one. But black's illigant. I needn't be ashamed to hold it up at any funeral on the countryside." By this time they had overtaken Mrs. Mooney and her son, who were talking to a knot of neighbours. Tony, with dismayed visage, slipped round to Dinny's free hand and whispered apologetically, "Och, Dinny, it was the wrong parcels we took in the dark, and before I knew where I was, she had it opened on me, and in such an admiration of it she was, that I hadn't the heart to be telling her. But I'll get it back tomorrow from the Crother, by some manner of manes, I will so." "Ah, wisht, and no matter about it," Dinny replied. "We'll swap and lave them the way they are. Me mother'd liefer have the other one." Tony's half-incredulous relief needed some further explanatory asides, and meanwhile compliments were politely passing between their mothers. "'Deed now, Mrs. Mooney, ma'am, that's a grand umbrella you've come by entirely. Rail off the common it is. I never seen the likes of it at all." "Ah, sure, ma'am, it isn't too bad. Me son's after bringing it home to me. But it's a heavy one, let me tell you, to be liftin' all the way, and me gown'll be destroyed streelin' through the mud. Bedad, it's the fine, tall, upstandin' stick you've got there to yours, Mrs. Doyle, this day, and that's no lie." Mrs. Doyle, smiling broadly, said merely, "Och, he's a young slyveen," but she suppressed a forthcoming unfavourable critique upon the silver-banded handle, which Tony, in haste to take the hint, seized, saying, "Step along wid you, mother, and I'll study it over your head. Sure, it's no great weight, once you're a bit used to carrying it." And thereupon 4 people, under 2 umbrellas, set their faces well satisfied home. End of section 26. Read by GERALD MOE, Tucker, Georgia. Section 27 of By Beach and Bog-Land, Some Irish Stories by Jane Barlow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Small Practice, Part 1. The most noteworthy event in Cocky McCann's history up to its 9th year was the accident by which he broke his arm and became for some weeks an inmate of the Ballygowran Union Infirmary. That this disaster befell him in the course of a repeatedly forbidden attempt to mount Mr. Scanlon's cross mare, and that he himself laid all the blame on the bosthoons who were after covering her with an ogish old bit of sacking as slithery as ice, the way nobody could get e'er a firm holt of her at all, were characteristic features easily recognizable by any of Cocky's acquaintances. That it had befallen him anyhow seemed a very serious matter to himself, but still more so to his mother, upon whom it entailed the grievous necessity of a temporary separation from her idolized only child. Nevertheless, his removal beyond reach of her petting and humouring gave him leisure to draw the morals pointed by his own doing and suffering, and to study various object lessons that were set before him as he roved convalescent through the wards. But although these were not wholly without effect, and although he did return to Ballylogan a few degrees less headstrong than he had left it, he had unluckily taken up one new notion which tended to obscure any traces of improvement, and even led his neighbours occasionally to pronounce him twice as ungovernable as he was before. This notion was a firm belief that during his sojourn in hospital he had acquired such skill in medicine and surgery as fully qualified him to prescribe for any of his ailing fellow creatures, or to operate upon them as circumstances seemed to demand. Of course, if Cucky had confined himself to entertaining this vainglorious opinion, it would have been a very harmless vanity, calling for nothing more censorious from his elders than, "Och, now, isn't it the quare old-fashioned crother?" But that was by no means the case. Cocky always had a perilous propensity for putting his theories into practice, nor did he forbear to do so here whenever he saw a chance. And in consequence, he became more than ever a terror to adjacent owners of small livestock, human and otherwise. Mrs. McLaughlin, for instance, was only just in the nick of time, by the best of good luck, to prevent him from administering to her little Lizzie a murky mixture compounded of varnish, washing soda, soft soap, and tea, which he declared looked and smelt the very same as the black bottle he used to be seeing Nurse Lane at the infirmary curing hundreds and thousands of childer out of. That was worse with the whooping cough than Lizzie. Luck did not always intervene so opportunely. In the case of the Nolan's duck, circumstances enabled Cocky to carry out his treatment with more freedom from interference. Having kept his patient under observation for some time, he had formed the opinion that it was waddling as crooked as a ram's horn, and furthermore, that the left leg was broke on it, and had a right to be plastered up stiff, in the manner as much as possible of a fractured limb, which he had watched with interest during his attendance at his medical school. And the result was that after a day's anxious search, the hapless fowl was discovered helplessly rooted to a retired spot by the ponderous ball of mortar and clay in which one leg had been encased. When extricated with difficulty, its lameness appeared to be so much aggravated that Mrs. Nolan was presently obliged to kill it to save its life at a dead loss. The finest young duck, she protested, in the parish, and worth every penny of half a crown, if it wasn't only for destruction being done on it by a bold-behaved little torment, that the police ought to be walking off to the lock-up out of decent people's way, if the sergeant was good for anything else except playing poker in the barrack-room and not minding his business. It is fair to note, on the other hand, how, in Mrs. McCann's opinion, so confident as to be proclaimed loudly from her own front door, 1 and 6 would have bought the last feather on the crother's back twiced over, and divil a much else anybody'd ha' got off it, a skinny little bag of bones, with ne'er a pen'worth of dirty mail thrown to it ever since it looked out of the shell. As for Cocky, in response to all upbraiding, he simply gave impudence, and declared with exasperated regret that, if the fool of a beastie'd had kept aisy with its quacking and bawling, he'd have had it grandly cured soon enough, for there was nothing else 'ud have been bringing anybody next or nigh the old shed once in a month of Sundays. The duck's fate thrilled from end to end of the McCann's cabin row, and the shock would have been more entirely unpleasurable if it had happened at the expense of some family other than the Nolans. They had never been very well liked at Ballylogan, especially since a married daughter and son-in-law had come to live with them. Nobody, indeed, had much to say against old Jim Nolan, nor the daughters, Katty and Anne, while the sayings against his wife and the 2 Gildeas were rather vague, being seldom more definite than statements which set forth that Mrs. Nolan was a quare one, and that Patsy Gildea had the face of an ass. Widow Gillety gave voice to the prevailing sentiment when she remarked of the Gildea-Nolan alliance that by the rule of contraries she'd have expected that Rose to have took up with some dacenter man than himself. Still, this hazy misliking would have in measure toned down the neighbours' disapproval of Cocky's unsuccessful experiment, had not their righteous wrath been sustained by a strong sense of the possibility that he might at any moment seek a subject among their own belongings, an uneasiness which found relief in anticipating the curtailment of Cocky's ill-employed hours of idleness by his attendance at the Letterowan National School. He had lately begun his education there, in accordance with directions left by his seafaring father, happily so much to his taste that he really followed the line of least resistance in carrying them out. Enforced abstinence now whetted his appetite for knowledge, until he was eager to resume his studies almost before Mrs. McCann considered his recovery sufficiently complete. The daily setting forth of Cocky McCann on an absence of several hours' duration was viewed with complacency by the eye of Ballylogan. His mother's tendency to regret was too trivial an exception to be regarded as more than, so to speak, a very slight cast in that composite orb. Before long, however, his schooling was again interrupted, this time by a local epidemic of influenza, which caused a prolongation of the Christmas holidays. They were at Ballylogan a dismal season, what with one thing and another, including, it must be said, the presence of Cocky, who turned the calamity to his own purposes. His pleasure was to call upon house-bound sufferers, whom if he could not always persuade patiently to receive his medicine, he not seldom succeeded in seriously alarming by the grave nature of his diagnosis. "I declare to goodness, ma'am," Mrs. Sweeney reported to a crony, "it's terrified entirely me poor sister was yesterday evening with the romancing he had out of him. Sitting all of a shake in her chair she was when I come in, and says I to meself the minute I laid eyes on her, as sure as anything the woman's got the shivering ague. But says she to me, 'twas just the turn she was after getting with the awful talk of Cocky McCann. For, says she, he run in and told her he well knew by the look of her it was mortal bad she was, with every sort of disparate sickness. Bedad, says she, I couldn't make an offer at repatin' the quare-sounding words he said was ailing me, for, says she, I never heard the like of them before. Not with Dr. White himself, says she, and sure, says she to me, if it was about getting her death she was with any natural description of complaint, that might be no more than the will of God, and some sense and reason to it. But what all that Cocky was after telling her was a dale worse than the new money or the blue rissy, and it gave her the cold creeps. And to the back of that there was some manner of outrageous old brash he was bidding her cure herself with, lamp oil and treacle and salt, I dunno the half of it, and axing me she was, should she be trying it. So says I to her, if she'd be said by me, she'd just drink a good sup of hot buttermilk whey, and let alone meddling with any of the spalpeen's prescriptions, set him up, that were fit to poison the parish. But sure now, ma'am, Mrs. McCann had a right to keep the tormentin' brat at home, instead of him to be running into other people's houses and frightening them out of their misfort'nate minds. To whom Julia Hogan replied, Och, Mrs. McCann, is it? Sure she's that foolish about him. It's my belief she consates he's the great doctor entirely. If he bid her take and ate the ashes off the hearth, she'd be apt to go do it, and as for him minding anything she said, she might all as well be speaking to the sparrows hopping in the hedges. Several other neighbors were visited with similar warnings and advice, which Kopke's mother was in truth quite powerless to prohibit. But before school opened again, his attention was diverted from the health of Ballylogan by a momentous occurrence. It was a piece of great luck, nothing less than his picking up on the road an envelope containing a £5 note. The white cover had not a stroke of writing on it, and the note, its sole contents, looked speckless too, as if little handled. Now, however, it was subjected to much fingering and minute scrutiny by a selection of the McCann's acquaintances, losing under the process some of its unsullied crispness, while its genuine character as a Bank of Ireland note, worth a 12 months' rent and more, seemed to be thereby only the firmlier established. Opinion was far less decided about the probable way in which it had come to be so improbably lying on the path under O'Carroll's fence, just at the gap where the Ballylogan children climb up and down to and from school. The most opposite views, again, were held as to what Mrs. McCann should do with this treasure trove. They ranged from those of the rigid moralist, who laid down the stern law that she had a right to go straight off and lave it with the police or Father Mooney, to the reckless declaration that she would be the biggest fool ever walked if she didn't spend every penny of it just as she pleased. In the end, she compromised the matter by determining to put it up safely until she could consult himself, otherwise Bernard McCann, who was expected home from a voyage in a few weeks' time. This arrangement met with, on the whole, approval, not being opposed even by Cocky, who was actually almost slightly overawed by the magnitude of his own achievement. The possibility of personally consuming such vast wealth did not occur to his wildest imagination, and he readily assented to the bestowal of the precious envelope in a recondite nook. But he did make his find a pretext for demanding more than usually frequent pennies from his mother. "Just you wait, then, till I come home with the next pounds and pounds note I get, me good woman," he would retort at any demur. And he so often heard laudatory comments upon the cuteness of the crother, mind you, that had the sense to know it was something valuable in place of to be tearing it up the way the other childer'd have been apt to do, that, with the conceit of wisdom and exultance in many extra sugar sticks, his elation waxed apace. In fact, his spirit might at this time have been augured strutting with very appropriate gait towards an imminent fall. As for Mrs. McCann, the keen edge of her pleasure at their good luck was permanently turned by a misfortune commonplace enough, too common, in the shape of a bad toothache which presently attacked her. Upon its advent, all her joy in the prospect of riches vanished away with the promptitude which occasionally disposes us to wonder that happiness, perpetually suspended at the mercy of any one among a myriad nerve threads, should ever attain to even the briefest span of existence. Being a very robust person, she naturally took a despondent view of her case, and when the malady had tormented her for a night and a day, she lost hope and temper. She morosely repelled the neighbor's sympathy, and even Cocky found his proffers of infallible remedies, extraction included, received with testy curtness, a novel and disconcerting experience, which made him all the more anxious that a state of things so uncongenial should come to a speedy end. He was far from pleased at being summarily told to run off with himself and leave moidering a body gabbing about what they had done in the infirmary. 'Twas no manner of use, and the cold pitaties 'ud do plenty well enough for the dinner. She didn't want anything at all, and couldn't be bothered warming them up. It was on his way to fetch a jug of water from the public pump, about sunset, that Cocky fell in with Mrs. Gildea, going the same errand. chiefly out of perversity, he held this unpopular person in somewhat high esteem, and treated her to more civility than he generally bestowed upon the other neighbors. Mrs. Gildea had just then been having words with her husband, who was sitting head in hands on a tub at her father's door. Her words had been to the effect that if there was a bigger old slouch in the country than himself, she didn't know where he look for him. Tom Gildea, whose several questionable qualities did not, to do him justice, comprise a huffy temper, had merely replied, "The county be choked. Sure, what chance has a man to be doing anything in the likes of this little old glory-hole? Unless he'd the luck of the young rapscallion there I see running out of Mrs. McCann's house, that's after picking up a fortin off the road, would ha' took the two of us over to the States you do be raving about." To which his wife had rejoined, with acrimony, "Bedad, then, it's one while a lazy divil like you'd be picking up e'er a fortune in the States, or any place else." But when, by and by, not many yards away, she overtook Cocky McCann at the pump, her manner and speech were bland and suave. Mrs. McCann, she said to him, was a very lucky woman to own a sensible, handy boy that would be fetching in her jugs of water, let alone finding her a pocket full of money, and handing her every penny of it to keep, which was more than many a one would have done. This flattery was especially refreshing to Cocky, who had missed his usual household affluence of it, and he responded by pumping for Mrs. Gildea so vigorously that her jug suddenly overflowed into her shoes. "Och, bad luck to you, the old spout of it that's quare," she said, with a jump backwards, "but sure there's no harm meant or done. Is it wetted you are, sonny dear? Well now, you're a good boy, and the next time you get anything on the road, I only hope you'll be bringing it in to me. I might be chance have a load of sweeties to swap for it." End of section 27. Read by GERALD MOE, Tucker, Georgia. Section 28 of By Beach and Bog-Land, Some Irish Stories by Jane Barlow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Small Practice, Part 2. "There mightn't ever be anything more on the road again," Cocky said, discreetly avoiding a committal of himself to this barter. "Ah, sure, it's just joking I am," said Mrs. Gildea, "for, of course, you'd be a-bringing whatever it was home to your mammy to put up somewhere safe, the way she's after doing with the £5 note, I'll be bound." "We have so," said Cocky. "I wouldn't suppose she'd be apt to telling you, now, what place she's keeping it in," said Mrs. Gildea. "She'd liefer not, for fear you'd be meddling with it and losing it on her." "Oh, wouldn't she not?" said Cocky, "when only for me she'd never have thought of the little old black tay-caddy in the hole in the wall, back of the dresser, by the foot of the bed, that's a dale the best place to be keeping it in." Why, to be sure, and so it is. Yourself was the cute one to be thinking of it. Back of the dresser be the foot of the bed, so that's where she has it, and a very handy, safe place entirely. You needn't be letting on to her that you was telling me, not that I'd be passing any remarks about it, no fear. It's nothing to me where other people do be keeping their old tay-caddies. And what'll your poor mammy do without you at all, to be running her messages for her, when you're presently going back again to the school? Tomorrow I'm going, said Cocky, but she's well able to be fetching the water and everything herself, only she's bad these 2 days with the toothache, and as cross as the cats. Not a bit of her would try the cold starch poultice I bid her, or I dare say she'd be well again now, but she might be better in the morning. On the contrary, however, in the morning Mrs. McCann was worse, or at any rate looked so, because her face had swelled all on one side, as big as 2 sizable heads of cabbage, Cocky assured Mrs. Gildea, whom he found waiting for him when he passed her door on his way back from the pump before breakfast with a can of water. At this time Cocky was under some concern about his mother's affliction, and this from fairly disinterested motives, as his absence all day at school would make her doleful and irascible mood a matter of small importance to himself personally. His wish for her relief was, therefore, mainly not a self-regarding sentiment, though he did in some measure consider the possible effect upon the replenishing of his dinner-basket. The face of her swelled up awful, and got ne'er a wink of sleep the whole night, Mrs. Gildea repeated upon hearing these symptoms. "'Deed now, the poor woman's to be pitied. But look here, sonny, I've got a little drop of stuff here you might be giving her, would make her sleep grand, and do her all the benefit ever was." She showed from beneath her shawl a hand holding a small, nearly empty bottle. "It always sent me poor father-in-law off like a top when he was bad a couple of years ago, every time he took it. You might as well have been offering to wake up a one of the hearthstones as him, 10 minutes after he'd had his dose of it. Little enough of it he left behind him, but there's something better than a small-sized spoonful in the bottle yet, and that'd do her finely. So just bring it home to her, there's a good boy, and bid her drink it straight off, the way she may get something you may call asleep, and as like as not be quit of the ugly toothache agin she wakes." "There wouldn't be an atom of use bidding her take it," said Cocky, "or anything else there wouldn't. I told her plenty of things to cure herself wid, but she won't touch e'er a one of them. As headstrong as can be she is over it. She's past my control," Cocky asserted solemnly, adopting a somewhat familiar phrase, not without enjoyment of it. "So you may be keeping the little old bottle." He was not quite sure whether he regretted or rejoiced to have this reason for rejecting Mrs. Gildea's offer. Certainly he did wish for his mother's cure, but that it should be wrought by another person's advice and assistance, when his own was disregarded and disparaged, would have seemed a very undesirable fulfillment of his desire. On the whole, probably he was glad of the excuse. But Mrs. Gildea persisted. "Sure, people do often be contrary, like in themselves, when they're sick," said she. "It's humour in them one must be, in a way. Wouldn't she be takin' e'er a sup of tay now?" "And what else would I be fetchin' the Walter for, if it wasn't to boil the kettle?" said Cocky. "She says a hot sup might be apt to do her good. Well, then, I'll tell you how you could contrive. Just get her attention distracted a bit, and slip what's in the bottle, body and bones, into her cup when she isn't lookin'. Ne'er a taste she'll get off it in the strong tay, but drink it down illigant unbeknownst, if you do the way I bid you, like a clever boy. And when you run home this evening, you'll find she's after sleepin' beautiful all the while you were away, and sorra the talk of any more toothache," Mrs. Gildea predicted, holding out the little bottle. Cocky stood irresolute. The plan had an attractive aroma of practical joking, while the promise of a mother once more cheerful and laudatory was undeniably alluring. But the conditions galled his professional pride. "And you needn't ever be lettin' on I gave it to you, or anything about it," Mrs. Gildea continued, "for very belike she might be mad wid us." This hint perceptibly strengthened Cocky's inclination towards compliance, for it showed that she did not propose to claim any credit from the cure, which seemed to him some amends for being unable to do so himself. Yet his jealous dread of a rival was a stubborn thing, and he hesitated still. Perhaps it would ultimately have prevailed with him, had not little Tim Daly happened just then to pass, pouring his soul in rapt enjoyment through a newly acquired penny whistle. Tim's face, always of a rather comic full-moon pattern, was for the time being a caricature, because he had blown the swollen cheek of a trumpeter, and the sight of the grotesque profile somehow recalled to Cocky his mother's visage as he had last beheld it, distorted and woebegone. Whereupon he suddenly extended his hand, saying, "Gimme." He had resolved, not without an effort of difficult virtue, to try Mrs. Gildea's remedy. He was quite successful in administering it surreptitiously. By this simple device of yelling, "Och, look at what's going up the road," he made himself an opportunity for tilting the contents of the little bottle into his mother's just poured-out cup. It suited his purpose all the better that, in her indignation at what appeared to her his ill-timed pleasantry, she drank up her drugged tea with hurried and heedless gulps. Even so, she alarmed him once by declaring that she got an ugly, unnatural sort of flavour off it. However, she accounted for this by supposing herself to have lost the right taste of her mouth with the tormenting cold she had in her unlucky teeth. And though she left some spoonfuls in her cup, Cocky opined that she had swallowed enough to test the efficacy of those dark trickling drops. His opinion was confirmed when he soon saw her begin to exhibit unmistakable signs of drowsiness, and heard her announce that the two eyes of her were sinking into her head, and that as soon as he had run off to school, she'd lie herself down on the bed to try could she get the chance of a sleep. so he sugared his slices of bread with a lavish hand, unreproved, and started for Letterowen in a sanguine frame of mind. Not long after his departure, Mrs. Gildea knocked at the McCanns' door. She knocked pretty loudly, and receiving no answer, stepped in and rapped loudlier on the table. Then she coughed violently and kicked a can standing on the floor so as to cause a sharp clatter. But finally, as the slumber whose depths she was gauging satisfactorily stood all these cautious trials, she stole swiftly up to the dresser with its dangling jugs and began a rapid groping behind it. At the foot of the bed, she was thinking to herself, back of the dresser in a little old tea-caddy. But when in a few minutes she slipped quietly out again, nobody could have guessed the presence of a small black japanned box hidden away under her shawl. This was quite early in the day, a couple of hours at least before the sluggard midsummer sun had attained his noon, but though the dusk had spread abroad out of every corner by the time that Mrs. McCann had any more visitors, they found her still sleeping heavily. They were her neighbors, Maggie Daly and Anne Hunt and Widow Kennan, who had come with such interesting news to tell and questions to ask that they shrilled and shook her into some sort of wakefulness after a while. But she remained so stupid and dazed that she took in at first only a small portion of the story they were relating. It was in substance that the two Gildeas had suddenly made a flitting to the best of everybody's belief for good and all. Tom Gildea had been seen setting off with himself and a bundle about sunrise that morning, and the beholders had assumed that he was merely going on the Shaughran, according to his custom, for a day or two. Andy Cole, the letter-carrier, however, reported that about 12 o'clock he had met Mrs. Gildea up beyond Dunothy, tramping towards Ogtyrone, and likewise laden with a large bundle, which had suggested a different significance for the movements of the pair. "So we was wondering, ma'am," said Anne Hunt to Mrs. McCann, "did Mrs. Gildea herself happen to tell you they were quittin' when you was talking to her this morning? For the Nolans let on she niver said a word to them of intending any such a thing." "Is it Mrs. Gildea?" Mrs. McCann replied perplexedly. "I never seen sight nor light of her this day at all, let alone spakin' to her. Och, woman alive, is it in your senses you are at all? Didn't meself and Mrs. Kennan here see her coming out of your door this morning with our own eyes, and we hanging up clothes?" "Aye, bedad, did we," corroborated Widow Kennan. "It was no great while after Cocky going to school. Sure, the woman's not rightly in her senses." "I don't know about them," Mrs. McCann said in bewilderment, "but if anybody came in, I wasn't minding them. Ever since I took me cup of tea at breakfast time, me head's swimming off me shoulders, and 10 strong men couldn't hold me eyes open. Ugly tea it was as ever I tasted." Mrs. Daly pounced swiftly upon the teacup, which was still standing on the table. goodness be wid us," she exclaimed, in continuation of a prolonged sniff. "It's laudanum she's after taking, enough to poison the parish. Small blame to her to be bothered and stupid. The only wonder is that the life's left in her at all. Stand up on your feet, ma'am, this minute, and keep stirring about, for it's lost you are if you fall off asleep again. Sure now, maybe the toothache had you distracted, but 'twas an awful thing to go take laudanum." "Sorra the sup I took," Mrs. McCann said, standing up dizzily. "Glad of it I'd have been, but I hadn't got a drop to me name." "Smell it, ma'am, smell it," Mrs. Daly said, handing the cup round appealingly, and her companions both said, with confirmatory inhalations, "Laudanum it is. And some other stuff along with it, I'm thinking," Mrs. Daly said, after further examination. "If it wasn't herself, it was that cocky at his tricks again, you may safely depend." "The poor child wouldn't do such a thing," his mother said feebly, a protest which was not considered to call for notice. "Where'd he get it?" Anne Hunt inquired more pertinently. "I saw him colloguing with Mrs. Gildea this morning early," Widow Kennan suggested, "outside of her door." "Then, mark my words, it was that one gave it to him," said Mrs. Daly, "and put it into his head to be poisoning his poor mother's cup of tea with it. She done it a purpose, very belike, thinking to have the poor woman sleeping stupid if anybody come in for to ransack the house on her, and she all alone in it by herself, the very way it happened. I'll bet you anything Tom Gildea and she had it settled up between them." Mrs. Daly went on, skipping from conclusion to conclusion as nimbly as a series of dexterously made ducks and drakes. "To be taken off out of this to-day, with whatever she was after grabbing, a £5 note, ma'am, she'd find uncommonly handy, and you lying there as good as a block of wood all the while she was ferreting about here." "The £5 note? Och, to goodness, woman, don't say so," Mrs. McCann said, pierced with dread through all her drowsiness. "Sure she doesn't know where I'm keeping it." "She'd get that aisy enough out of Cocky," said Mrs. Daly, "and be the same token, here he is himself," she added, moving quickly towards the door. So it befell Cocky, as he bolted headlong over his dusky threshold, to find himself obstructed by a matronly form, and sternly addressed, "Och, you bold boy, what for did you be poisoning your poor mammy with laudanum?" The object with which Mrs. Daly had adopted this attitude and tone was completely gained by the result, for Cocky, so much taken aback that he thought only of self-defence, replied incriminatingly, "Get out of my road. It was nothing but a weeny tint out of a little bottle Mrs. Gildea gave me to make her get a wink of sleep." Mrs. Daly wheeled round triumphant upon her gossips. "What did I tell yous? Aye, to be sure, she had her sleeping rail convenient, while she herself was laying hands on your fine £5 note." "You old Gabby," said Cocky, recovering his confidence, "do you imagine or suppose I'd have told her we had it in the tay caddy if I didn't know me mother kept the K in her pocket, that nobody can get at, or else yourself would be as apt as any." But he was dismayed by a burst of derisive laughter. "Och, goodness pity the crother," said Widow Kennan. "What differ does he think a K makes, in or out of a pocket, when there's nothing to hinder any person grabbing the little box and away with it?" And through all the other voices struck one more thrilling, as Mrs. McCann, who had been groping behind the dresser, rose from her knees with a piercing wail. "Och, we're us through. It's gone, sure enough. There's the empty place it was in. She's took it while I was dead asleep, and we'll niver set eyes on it again." They never have from that good day to this. The loss, with its attendant circumstances, was intensely mortifying to Cocky McCann, and put him quite out of conceit with a medical career. Perhaps the most unpalatable draught in his cup of afflictions was the recital which he could not always avoid hearing his mother give to sympathetic neighbors, and the bitterest drops were always at the bottom, for she invariably wound up the narrative with, "But what I think baddest of was her making a fool that way of the innocent child." End of section 28, read by Gerald Moe, Tucker, Georgia. Section 29 of By Beach and Bog-Land, Some Irish Stories by Jane Barlow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Lingering Guest, Part 1. When Mrs. Van Herder died at her house on Marksville Avenue, New York, leaving a legacy of $100 to each servant who had been over 3 years in her employment, the Irish girl, Rose Byrne, could claim the bequest, having scrubbed the Van Herder floors for 5 long years, and 10 minutes after she heard of her good fortune, she had firmly made up her mind what she would do with it. She would go home straightway. Home for Rose lay across the Atlantic on the store-beaten shore of the County Donegal, and a dozen 12-months had passed since she had seen it, except in her dreams. If the legacy had come sooner, she might, while waiting for the liner to sail, have spent much of her time and not a few of her dollars in the purchase of presents and fine clothes, wherewithal to glorify her rejoining of her family circle. But by now so many a precious stone had dropped sadly out of that ring of hers, that she knew she would find only a small remnant safe in its setting. An old grandmother and a married sister were all the near relations left to welcome her back. This, and the prudence learned from experience, made her preparations simple and thrifty. "I'm thinking," she said to herself, "that I'd do better to not be buyin' till I get home, for then I'll have a notion of what's wantin'. Buyin' things for them now is the same as puttin' the right keys into the wrong holes. There's naught amiss with the keys themselves, only they won't open them locks. The stores do be uncommon illigant and tasty, but sure I'll wait." Rose, in fact, was thinking that the things most wanted at home would probably be quite common and not elegant at all. And when she reached Kilgowran, she very soon saw that her conjectures were even righter than she had expected them to be. Her grandmother's white-walled, brown-thatched cabin, which looked like a weather-beaten mushroom on the wide, dark bog, was in reality still more poverty-stricken than it had seemed in her memory. Partly, perhaps, because those lofty and spacious chambers overseas, which you could fill with clearest brilliance by a twirl of your finger and thumb, contrasted so strongly with this one dark little room, where the rafters slanted low above the uneven mud floor, and the shadows among them were seldom disturbed by anything brighter than a stray flicker glancing from the hearth. Its mistress had been old and gaunt as long as Rose could recollect, and was now, of course, older and gaunter than ever. Her decrepit, broken-down aspect struck Rose painfully as they sat opposite one another soon after her arrival on small, rough, creepy stools by the crumbling glow of the turf sods. It was a sad thing, she thought, to see an infirm old woman so poorly off that she had to wrap herself in a ragged greatcoat as she crouched huddled up uneasily over her fire, which she stirred with a broken spade handle. Rose reflected with some consolation that to provide a decent warm shawl was certainly in her power. Any sort of comfortable armchair might be, she feared, beyond her means. Since Rose's last sight of it, however, old Mrs. Behan had added something to her little dwelling's scanty contents. Another grandchild, namely, the orphan daughter of her son Peter, a slip of a girl just growing up. Maggie Behan was now nearly of the same age that Rose Byrne had been when quitting the bogland of Kilgowran, and she looked very much as her cousin had done a dozen troublesome years ago. And it was not long before Rose perceived that Maggie occupied the position of prime favorite which had formerly been her own. This, indeed, became apparent on the very first evening, despite Rose's temporary distinction as a newly returned traveller, and it was made unmistakably plain next morning when Mrs. Behan declared to Rose her opinion that there had never been a one of them all who could hold a candle to little Maggie for good looks, though the Behans were always as handsome a family as any in the countryside. An impartial judge would have seen nothing more remarkable in Maggie's round, cheerful face than that pleasant freshness of early youth which the Irish people, possibly with a Danish reminiscence, call pig beauty. So Rose knew well enough what was betokened by such extravagant praise. But she was not left merely to draw inferences. Their grandmother had a habit of expressing herself frankly, and accordingly she soon spoke her mind to Rose on this point. "Sure now, you and me was always great, Rose, me dear," she said, "but little Maggie, the crother, she's what the heart of me's fairly set on, and small blame to me, for her equal won't be aisy got. and bedad 'twas the same way ever. Ne'er a word had I agin poor Nora, your mother, at all, but Peter was the lovely child, that's your poor uncle, Maggie's father. Aye, indeed, I always had a wonderful wish for Peter. Though it was scarcely in the nature of things that Rose should not feel somewhat aggrieved at finding herself thus superseded, circumstances helped her to take a philosophical view of the situation, saying to herself, "Why, it's only natural Granny'd think a deal of Maggie that she's after bringing up, and sure, maybe the more she thinks of her, the better these times, for who else is there to be stopping along with her and minding her when she's getting so old and feeble?" Therefore, as the days went past, Rose, keeping a watchful eye on significant trifles, was glad to see no lack on Maggie's part of due helpfulness and affection. She'll be well looked after anyhow, she thought, as she observed her young cousin's energetic redding up of the house-room and good-humoured ways with the querulous old woman, and once she spoke some of these sentiments aloud. Her grandmother and she had walked across the bog to 11 o'clock Mass at Kilgowran Chapel, and were sitting to rest in the August sun on the low, dilapidated wall of the chapel yard. This Kilgowran burial ground is a dreary, unrestful place, overlooked by the backs of several houses, and overgrown with tall, harsh green nettles and rusty brown docks. Among them the few grey stones and the wooden crosses, plentier because cheaper, are sometimes nearly lost. These low, crookedly set crosses vary in hue from time to time, according to the different painting jobs that have been in progress thereabouts, as the leavings in a pot are often devoted to this purpose. A vivid canary was just then the prevailing colour. Mrs. Behan surveyed them musingly as she and Rose sat to wait for Maggie, who had gone on a message, and she presently remarked, "I've no liking for that yallery colour. It's as ugly as sin. If it was me, I'd sooner a deal have the pink one there is yonder over young Andy Fitzsimmon. His father gave it a new coat the time he was doing up Mr. Purcell's front palings a while ago. But, sure, how would poor Maggie be sticking up crosses or anything else over me, the crother, try her best." "Maggie's a very good girl," Rose said, to give the conversation a livelier turn. "I don't know what you'd do without her." But her commendation of her cousin, generally so eagerly taken up, had not the usual effect upon her grandmother, for instead of replying, "Aye, bedad," and launching out into complacent praises, Mrs. Behan answered, firmly and gloomily, "I'd do first-rate, grand I'd do, if I got the chance," an unexpected response which surprised Rose considerably, but Maggie's arrival just then prevented comment or explanation. In the course of the next week, Rose was again puzzled by some of her grandmother's sayings and doings. What perplexed her first was a marked disapprobation of the little purchases that she made for the benefit of the cabin and its occupiers. the sorely needed garments or utensils or groceries, never had a reception more gracious than, well now, yourselves the great Gabby to be bringin' home all them contrivances, litterin' up the place. 'Deed, it's a pity to see you throwin' away your money on the likes of such old trash that nobody wants. Moreover, Mrs. Behan's manner showed plainly that these protests were not merely polite disclaimers, but sincere utterances of her sentiments. Rose wondered and pondered without catching sight of any plausible reason. She well knew that none of her family had ever inclined towards excessive thrift, either on their own or other people's account. Stranger still, Mrs. Behan began to let fall what sounded to Rose terribly like hints that she had outstayed her welcome and had better end her visit. That this should have happened already, or, in truth, could happen ever at all, was a bitter thought to Rose, and one night, after her grandmother had been talking about the sailing of steamers from Queenstown, she felt so badly that she ate hardly a morsel of supper and went to bed early, almost resolved to leave next morning. But thereupon Mrs. Behan had manifested such deep concerns at these signs of indisposition, and had so bestirred herself to totter about, making tea and toast for the invalid, and scaring away intrusive hens whose crocking might disturb her honey, that Rose found it for the time being impossible to harbor any longer those grievous suspicions. End of section 29, read by GERALD MOE, Tucker, Georgia. Section 30 of By Beach and Bog-Land, Some Irish Stories by Jane Barlow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Lingering Guest, Part 2. Then one evening, on her return from the post office, she discovered her grandmother alone in the kitchen. The old woman was stooping over the table, upon which she had spread out the contents of Rose's large wash-leather purse. Perceiving herself detected, she attempted first to conceal her occupation with a corner of her shawl, and next to assume an unabashed demeanor, failing in a pitiable way that made Rose hasten to say gaily, accepting the scrutiny as a matter of course, "Well, Granny, it's fine and rich I am these times, am't I?" And, restored to self-respect, Mrs. Behan spoke her mind without embarrassment. "Oh, bedad you are, but it's not very long before you won't be so. 5 and 9 pence you're after spendin' since this day week. You might as well be lettin' on to keep a sup of water in an old sack as in your purse. Never your fool's foot you set outside the door, but you'll throw away a couple of shillin's. Och, you needn't be offerin' to hide it. I see the big lump of a parcel you have under your arm this minute, and the end of it'll be that before we know where we are, the passage money'll be gone. Look there," she said, pointing to the coins, which she had counted into 2 unequal heaps. "That's your fares on the boat, and that other's all you have left for wastin', and it, by rights, you'll want to live on till you get places on the other side. But you'll keep it up, all I can do or say, till you'll not lave enough to take the two of yous over. The two of me, Granny, Rose said. Sure the dear knows it's lonesome entirely I'll be going across, and what for in the world would I be paying the double fares? Where's Maggie? Said Mrs. Bayhan. Maggie, said Rose, and now what would bewitch me to be taking Maggie away, and she the only one you have to be doing e'er a hand's turn for over here? Well enough I can be doing meself all the hand's turns I want, said Mrs. Bayhan. What'd ail me to not? Haven't I got the hens, and I might be dropping down off me standing feet any minute of the day, and then what'd become of little Maggie? It's the best chance for her altogether. Maggie'd be frettin' woeful if she was took away from you, said Rose. Ne'er a foot she'd come, it's my belief, and anyhow 'twould be no sort of thing to go do. I wouldn't be thinking of it at all. They argued the point for a long time without change of opinion on either side, until at last Rose said, Well, Granny, you know I'm going on Tuesday to stop a while with me sister up at Clochranbeg, so 'twill be time enough to talk about Maggie when I come back. There's no hurry. And in this adjournment Mrs. Bayhan had to acquiesce with what patience she could. During her fortnight's visit to the struggling McAteer family, away in the furthest corner of the wide country, Rose considered the question much and anxiously, with the result that on her journey back to Kilgowran she was sometimes repeating in her mind a decision at which she had reluctantly arrived. I'll try get a place in this country, she said to herself. It's poor living and bad wages, and I well know the best way to lend them a helping hand is from across the water. But how would Granny, the crother, understand? And I'll promise her that if anything happens her, I'll take Maggie back wid me then to the States. Maybe that'll content her. But Rose never gave that promise, for when she reached the little brown and white cottage in the black bog, she found it more lonesome within than without, and running in a fright to the Dohertys, its far-off nearest neighbors, she heard the worst news. Mrs. Doherty, looking scared and solemn, related how, the evening after Rose left, Mrs. Bayhan had asked them to take in Maggie for a little while, as she herself was real bad and going into Ballymoyle Infirmary, and how on that day week, when Jim Doherty had tramped over to inquire for her, he heard that she was dead and buried. Took very suddent, the crother, God be good to her, Mrs. Doherty said, or to be sure she'd send word by some manner of mains to poor Maggie that she set such store by, and that's sittin' here in desolation in the corner ever since, as quiet as a bird hunted out of its 7 senses. Maggie did indeed look so wan and woebegone that Rose's first thought was, she'd never have been persuaded to come away with me. If I had but known, I might have promised to take her safe enough, instead of to be vexing poor Granny would goin' against the notion, and I'd liefer than a great deal I had so. However, she was obliged to mingle active exertions with the regret that made them all dreary and wearisome. She could not afford to linger, lest her little fortune should actually, as poor Granny had dreaded, dwindle away, leaving her without the means of paying her cousin's passage. That Maggie must now accompany her was obvious, for who else would be mindin' the girl? And Maggie herself had apparently no wishes one way or the other. So Rose hastened to make their preparations before the waning autumn became stormier winter, and the long amber rays, which seemed stooping to peer in under thatched eaves at little low windows, should be all lost among clouds and mist. One thing that she did gave some small consolation to Maggie and herself. She bespoke a wooden cross for their grandmother's grave from Jim Doherty, who was a great hand at carpentry. Jim at first made some demur about accepting the commission, on grounds that he might be bothered to find the right grave there promiscuous in the Union corner. But in the end he consented, and refused to take a farthing for his work, and promised to paint the cross a fine, strong pink, and, if possible at all, to set it in the proper place, though about this he still expressed doubts. So Rose entrusted Mrs. Doherty with the key of the deserted cabin till Mrs. McAteer could take possession of its few effects, and she and Maggie said farewell to Kilgowran. The cousins voyaged safely to New York, and were fortunate enough to get situations there in the same household. One day, soon after Rose had reported their arrival to Mrs. Doherty at Kilgowran, she received an Irish letter, which she and Maggie spelled out with bewildered amazement at first, and finally with almost incredulous joy. It was written by the Kilgowran schoolmaster, from the dictation evidently of more than one person, which made its style rather involved and obscure, as we may perceive. Dear Rose and Maggie Jewel Macree, that has no call to be frettin' all the while. Sure, now, Rose, you needn't be mad wid me, for the only plan I could contrive to get you out of it was to take off wid meself to the infirmary as soon as I got your back turned, for then I well knew you wouldn't be long quitting yourself and bringing little Maggie wid you. So I bid Jim Doherty let on I was the old woman they were after buryin' there on Friday. But afraid of me life I was, lest he wouldn't have the wit to be tellin' you the right lies. Dear Miss Rose Byrne, you can bear me witness that ne'er a word of truth I told you, good or bad, except saying I couldn't tell the very place the grave was, and small blame to me for that same, when herself is sitting here by her fire this minute, and well able to be giving impudence as ever she was in her life. But I mean to let you know I didn't go back of me promise about the cross. No fear. A grand little one it is, and I have it painted as pink as a rose, the way it had a right to be. Dear Miss Byrne, so when I brought it over to her just now, The big stookan he was to go do such a thing, Rose commented on reading this. Nothing else would suit her, but I must stick it up for her on the wall alongside of her dresser, and an elegant appearance it has. I may say Mr. Joseph Gogarty, the national school teacher, is in a great admiration of it altogether. I am glad to state that I consider the memorial cross a neatly made and tastefully constructed article. J.G. Indeed now, Rose, yourself was a very good girl to think of spending your money on it, if Jim Doherty would let you, and there will I be keeping it, dry and convenient, till whenever I want it, please God, and then Jim Doherty will see there will be no mistake about where it's put in the burying ground. And, Maggie, Alana, you will be getting on finely in the States, and don't be lonesome, me jewel, for there do be no chances in Kilgowran, and sure the hens is grand company to me. So no more at present from your grandmother, Honoria Behan, and Jim Doherty. Saints above, but herself's the great rogue, glory be to goodness, Rose said, when they had at last puzzled out the real state of affairs. And rightly she got the better of me that time, and quare fools she made of the two of us, that were frettin' ourselves distracted, and she just waitin' ready to flourish up out of her bed like an old cricket, leppin', and back again wid her into her little house as soon as she had us safely landed on board. But all the same, it's wonderin' I am, Maggie, if she isn't apt to be lost entirely without either of us. I'll save hard, said Maggie. With such a power of dollars in me wages, it won't be a great while till I have enough to get back to her. Ah, Rose, dear, me heart's cold to think of her sittin' there with that old pink cross stuck up on the wall. But, please God, that's where I'll find it yet when I get home to her, and then I'll not be long taking it down. And at the present time, Maggie is still saving hard, and the pink cross still hangs on the wall beside her grandmother's dresser. End of section 30, read by Gerald Moe, Tucker, Georgia. Section 31 of By Beach and Bog-Land, Some Irish Stories by Jane Barlow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Loughnaglee. Mrs. Molly Whelehan told the story to her granddaughter, Helena Mahoney, much as she herself had heard it from her own grandmother, who, having lived at the very time and place of its end, had a right, as Mrs. Whelehan said, to know the whole of it. They were seated on a fine swarded bank by the northern shore of Loughnaglee, and resting, that is to say, Helena was resting, for her grandmother seemed just as fresh and brisk as when they had set out 2 or 3 hours before, which was absurd, for Helena had been quite lately sent to stay with her, because a family conclave had decided that the crother was gettin' a great age entirely, and too old and feeble to be left any longer livin' her lone. Whereas now, The day but one after Helena's arrival, her grandmother had nearly tramped the 2 feet off of her, gathering rushes to patch the roof of the calf's shed from breakfast time till noon. Loughnaglee is set in level green land with low shores except at its northern end, where a little hill range sends down a spur to the water's edge, overlooking it with a bold, furzy crag lifted on a pedestal of steep grass slopes. Beneath this run very tall blackthorn hedges, which here enclose the dwindled lake corner, turning to either hand in symmetrically right lines and angles, so that it is like a small court with 3 high, thick walls. Its water floor generally lies in shadow, looking somberly solid and opaque, as if paved with black flags, even when the rest is all shimmering blue or silver. Perhaps this gloomy aspect may have conspired with an echo born of the cliff to suggest and foster the belief, whence Loughnaglee has come by its name, the Lake of the Cries, but no one has so far found or invented any legend to explain its origin. Wide shadow fell heavily on the water as the old woman and the girl sat by it, close to the last sloe bush on the eastern shore. For although it was midsummer and midday, everything scowled back sympathetically and unseasonably at the lowering cloud canopy overhead. "If it's trampin' round Loughnaglee as often as meself you were," Mrs. Whalehan said, as they sat down and her granddaughter complained of being kilt, "it's little enough you'd think of steppin' as far as the 5 Stones for a bundle of rushes. But sure we can be restin' here aisy for a bit, till it's time to go in and put on the pitaties. And bedad if any people was livin' all their lives beside it as long as I am, they wouldn't have so much talk out of them about the quare things there do be on the low. Ne'er a sign of them I seen, anyway." "I wouldn't suppose it was any queerer than another little old low," said Helena, who, being momentarily out of humour, threw some disparagement into her tone. "For the matter of that," replied the grandmother, promptly changing front, "them that never set foot next nor nigh it till last Monday isn't very apt to have any great opinion about the queerness that might or mightn't be in it. Sure, it's much if they know the raison it got the name Loughnaglee on it at all." "It had to be called some name, I should suppose," said Helena, who was still inclined to suppose perversely, "and one's as good as another." "Well, now, indeed and bedad, the people were fine fools if they'd no better sort of raison than that when they called it the Low of the Cries in the Gaelic," said Mrs. Whalehan, "but there's some could be tellin' you a different story, and a one that's no lie either, to me certain knowledge." "Could they so?" said Helena, who had been cooling her hands and face with the clear water, and felt her curiosity revive. "But before ever that happened," said Mrs. Whalehan, "I was hearin' tell about the Cries. For they do say that if a man's anywheres convenient to the low, sittin' here beside it, maybe, or up a bit on the hill, and if he hears anything cryin' and callin' him by his name, He may depend there's some harm after befalling the woman he sets the most store by in this world, whoever she may be, his mother, or his wife, or his child, or his sweetheart, just accordin', though it's far enough away she was all the while. To be sure, then, that's rail quare, said Helena. I wonder is it the truth? You'll be wonderin' a long time before you make a bowl of stirabout wid it, Mrs. Whalehan said oracularly. But very belike your mammy was tellin' you again now what happened me grandmother's brother in the same identical place we're sittin' in this minute, I might say. She was not, said Helena. No great talk of Loughnaglee she has these times. Only a slip of a grey shack, she says she was, and she's gettin' married and quittin' out of it. Herself hasn't much nother in her to be disrememberin' it, if she was 20 graysatches. But I never had any such great wish, so to spake, for Biddy, Mrs. Whalehan said frankly. She always took after her poor father's old sister, Nellie Whalehan, that was as contrary as a wild hen. However, what happened me grandmother's brother, Jim M'Farlane, was before my time, when they were all livin' in the empty house fornint me own, and the Kavanaghs were in the next one that's gone to ruin. And the old people were very wishful to be makin' up a match with Jim M'Farlane and Nora Kavanagh, the only daughter. Me grandmother said she knew Nora had a likin' ever for Jim, and Jim had nothin' agin it, till Mrs. Kavanagh's niece, Rose Moore, come to stop with them, and then he seemed taken a notion he might be better satisfied if he had got her. Just for the sake of variety, for me grandmother said she wasn't any nicer than Nora, unless that might be the raison. But too young he was to be firm in his mind. However, he was betwixt and between, and they had nothin' settled this way or that way, when the two girls took it in their heads one day to go pull sloes along the hedge here, that were just turned black. It was the grand hedge for sloes, and bedad it's full of them this minute, if they were ripe. The white blossom on it does be a sight to behold at the turn of the winter, and the sloes do be the size of young plums, with a bloom on them you could write your name in. Grand wine they'd make. So off they set in the mornin', and when they came here, they found Jim M'Farlane up on the hill there, with his terrier after rabbits, and they only passed him the time of day, and that was all. And Rose went with her basket along this low side of the hedge, and Nora over yonder, Mrs. Whalehan pointed across the smooth dark water, where there's somethin' of a steep bank. Well now, after a while, Jim was mindin' the dog that had him nearly bothered altogether with the barkin' and yelpin' it kept up at a rabbit hole, but all the same it seemed to him he heard somethin' callin' his name with a woeful screech. And says he to himself, that's Rose Moore about drowndin' herself as sure as the sun's in the sky. And off wid him to the place he'd seen her goin', but there she was pullin' away on the field side of the hedge, and sorra a pin's point's amiss wid her, and ne'er a bit of her was after callin' him or hearin' anythin', only the little dog barkin' and yellin'. Howne'er he stood out that some person was screechin' in it, and they looked through the hedge here to try was there any signs of Nora over there. And at first they seen nothing, but presently they noticed a white streak on a bush opposite, like as if a bough was wrenched off it, and the next minute they seen a white streak again in the black water, and what was that but poor Nora's apron, and she floating across to them on the set of the current. So Jim got her on shore by some manner of means, but the breath was out of her body entirely. And the crother had the thorn bough clutched in her hand, the way they knew she was holding on to it till it broke, and calling to Jim, and he running off from her after Rose more, that not ailed in the world. Then she needn't lose her life only for him being mistook that way, said Helena. She need not, goodness may pity her, and only for him having the story in his head about calling it well enough he'd know Nora's voice, that he was used to all the days of his life. So if there's no reason for what people do be saying about the Lough, get me a one. There was raison enough to drown the poor girl, anyhow. But what I hope in me heart is that the crother wasn't seeing Jim, and he starting off and laving her that thought so much of him, for the sake of going to Rosie Moore. She might aisy catch sight of him through the hedge, lepping down the hill, and 'twould be fit to break her heart. Sure, if she was to be drownded the next minute, that'd be less the matter, said Helena. 'Twould make no differ to her then. It's little the likes of you or anybody else knows what mightn't make a differ, said her grandmother. Some folks do be saying she didn't die content, God be good to her, and wasn't restin' aisy. I mind meself hearin' old Christy Nolan and Judy Dunn sayin' that long ago they seen 'twas about the time of Jim and Rose's wedding, for they got married after all, but me grandmother said Rose wouldn't look at him for a great while, she was that mad wid him for lettin' Nora be drownded. What did they see? Said Helena. Ah, me dear, according to my opinion, there wasn't an atom of truth in it. The Kavanaghs were very decent, respectable people. I never heard tell of e'er another one of them walkin', and forby that, more betoken, look at all the years I'm livin' alongside the Lough, and sight nor light I seen of e'er such a thing, in the daytime at any rate, and nobody has any call to be rovin' about in the night. If they see anything quare then, they've themselves to thank for it. I don't believe— Och, what was that? Helena gripped her grandmother's arm and shrank beside her, as a croaking chuckle approached them, breaking into a laughter-like skrill, while a snowy gleam appeared, crossing over the murky water. Sure, only the big gull, said Mrs. Whalehan, pointing up to the wide white wings as they sailed by. But it's no good sign for the weather when that sort comes streelin' in so far from the say, and bedad, I think there's a shower blowin' up on the wind this instant. So we'd do better to be stirrin' ourselves till we get home dry. Indeed, the first large drops were stamping circles on the capable water, and ripples were rising and reeds bending to rub them out, as Mrs. Whalehan went with Helena home. The old woman was considering that she must fetch in a creel of turf before the day turned out too entirely soft on her, but her granddaughter's thoughts were occupied somewhat fearfully with the story she had just been told. It seemed to her that life at lonely Loughnaglee would henceforth have one more shadow thrown by the fate of Nora Kavanagh, who didn't die content. End of section 31, read by Gerald Moe, Tucker, Georgia. Section 32 of By Beach and Bog-Land, Some Irish Stories by Jane Barlow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Moriarty's Meadow, Part 1. For some time, Johnny Quinn of Letterard had been looking over the low stone wall at his bit of young oats, which you could almost see grow in the midsummer sunshine, when he was pulled by the sleeve and, turning round, beheld little Joe O'Hay with a grey kid tugging at the other end of a string. "Johnny, man," said Joe, "couldn't you take and give the baste a lift up there for me? She'd get grand grazing on it." Joe spoke remonstrantly, as if Johnny had been neglecting an obvious duty, as he pointed to the roof of Felix Moriarty's cabin, which stood just across the lane. The cabin was very small, with one tiny window pane in its mud walls, which were deeply weather-stained under the eaves, and from which the whitewash had worn off, leaving large brown patches. But its worst point, considering it as a dwelling house, was the roof, for the thatch undulated in hillocks and hollows, and also bore a luxuriant crop of grass, almost as long and thick and green as the thriving oats over the way. This seemed to little Joe a desirable pasture for his kid, whose browsings along the stone-dyked lane were but scanty, and hence his appeal to his taller friend. Johnny, however, was of a different opinion, and replied, "Sure not at all. The cruthers over small-sized to be cocking up that height off the ground. It's breaking her 4 legs she's apt to be before you'd get her down safe. Or belike she'd be losing herself in the long grass, or maybe it's putting his roof up for a meadow Moriarty is all the while. Aye, bedad, you may depind that's what he's doing. So just keep along the road with her steady, me son, and niver mind anything growing where she's no call to be trespassing." Accordingly, Joe and the kid sauntered on, leaving Johnny to his oats. But Johnny's attention had caught on Felix Moriarty's thatch, and did not disengage itself quickly. His own pleasantry, too, about Moriarty's meadow had taken his fancy, and he continued to repeat and elaborate it in his thoughts. At last, the forenoon being long and employment scarce, he actually went so far as to climb, sickle in hand, up on the waving roof, where he was presently slashing vigorously. "Bedad now," he said, surveying the tufts which had fallen round him, "I'm after knocking that same down in fine style. I did so, and wasn't long about it either." Nor did he stop here. Having raked together the crop, and added a few bundles of grass from the bank, he carefully built up on an inconveniently sloping base a symmetrical little cock. This he secured with a rope scientifically twisted of the weathered bents along the border of his oats, and then, jumping down noisily into the lane, contemplated his handiwork with complacent pride. Only one element was wanting in his satisfaction with it. There were no spectators to share his amusement and admire his wit. The key of the locked cabin door lurked hidden in some crevice of the thatch, for Felix Moriarty was away at the haymaking in a district where work seemed less slack. Nobody was about in the neighboring fields. Even Joe O'Hay and the kid were out of sight round the corner. "Sure, now it's a grand joke," Johnny repeated to himself more than once, "and it looks as comical as anything, sittin' there up over the man's door, as if it consated it was in the middle of a 7-acre field. Anybody'd be laughin' at it that seen it, passin' by." But of passers-by there appeared to be small prospect, as this lonely upland lane led no whither in particular, and the nearest dwelling was merely his own cottage, the topmost thatch of which peered just visibly over the edge of a long slope. "It'll be 20 pities," Johnny declared, 20 pities and a half, if nobody sees it before it's blew away with the wind. At that moment, all these pities sadly threatened to come about. Still, Johnny had a daring and ingenious turn of mind. Early the next morning, in Rathbeg, a village some few miles from Letterard, much excitement was awakened by the discovery of certain handbills which had been posted up on walls and doors in several conspicuous places. They were white foolscap sheets, written upon in large round hand to the following effect: "Men of Rathbeg, assemble in your thousands this Saturday evening to mow the meadow of the evicted tenant Felix Moriarty on the town land of Gortramackileen at Letterard. Down with tyrants." These placards must have been affixed during the night, and nobody in Rathbeg knew anything about the matter, a secrecy which, together with the shortness of the notice given, suggested that some peculiar urgency in Felix Moriarty's affairs made it expedient to render him the required assistance without incurring the observation of the constabulary. Such a state of things was not by any means unprecedented, and would in itself strongly dispose the men of Rathbeg to be active on his behalf, although none of them were acquainted with Moriarty except vaguely by name, or indeed knew much more about little out-of-the-way Letterard than that it had for proprietor an ill-reputed landowner. On the other hand, most people were just then too busy getting in their hay to spare easily even the fag end of the lingering daylight, especially as the unsettled aspect of the weather made every dry hour doubly precious. And to be sure, it was a long step from Rathbeg to Letterard. Hence there were abundant materials for the debate which was carried on in and about Finucane's public for a considerable time after the finding of the summons. Theg Ahern, the village orator, urged eloquently that it would be a good job to lend anybody a helping hand against the likes of such a notorious old, black-hearted, nay-gurly, exterminating, widow-robbin', childer-starvin' miscreant of a land-grabber as Old Warden, himself and his sheriff's writs. But then Timothy Dolan argued briefly, yet effectively, that there were plenty of as good jobs and better to be done in their own bits of fields, without tramping 6 miles over the country after them. The hearers who said, "I bedad," and "True for you," to this sentiment seemed nearly as numerous as those who received it with murmurs of mean-spirited and unmanly, so the issue remained doubtful. Meanwhile, the originator of the discussion, seated at his favourite post on the wall of his letterard oat-field, was speculating about the result. Not many hours had passed since Johnny Quinn had made his way home under the waning moonlight, through dewy fields, from his stealthy bill-sticking at Rathbeg. He had himself composed and written and copied the notices overnight in the emptied National Schoolroom, with some assistance from his old friend Peter Clary, the teacher, to whom he did not communicate their contents. Mr. Clary, however, though he preferred to be discreetly ignorant, may have guessed at their purport from the words which he was occasionally called upon to spell. "Och, not at all, Johnny. There does be but one R in tyrant, and all the I's you have is a Y and an A. You always made an uncommon bad offer at the orthography." And now Johnny, blinking half drowsily in the sunshine, spent most of the day in looking forward hopefully to the success of his plot. It had occurred to him yesterday, when enjoying his own wittiness embodied in the absurd haycock, and feeling how much that enjoyment would be enhanced by the presence of spectators. To assemble these by a stratagem which would raise the laugh on them for coming was a project with a twofold charm, and it fully occupied his mind from the moment of its first conception until he had evolved and, so far as lay in his power, carried out all the details. If he had been asked what he expected to gain in case things happened as he hoped, he might have truthfully replied, "A fine shindy entirely," for that outcome was undoubtedly uppermost in his anticipations. Suppose that 12 or so of the Rathbeg men were moved by his bogus summons to tramp over with their scythes in the evening, and, upon arriving, found their job was nothing more than simply the removal of the pygmy cock from its ridiculous site. "Be jabbers, it's ragin' mad they all'll be, as sure," Johnny said, chuckling as he rehearsed the scene. "Where's Moriarty's meadow that's evicted, says they, and that we're come to mow for?" "Is it? Where is it?" says I. "Musha, where else but here?" I says, "for on the roof I'll be, up over your fools' heads. And I'll bet me brogues it's the queerest little meadow ever a man was evicted out of," says I. "Leppin' they'll be." About the incidents of this promising fray, Johnny felt no anxiety at all. He did not, of course, propose to encounter the exasperated visitors quite single-handed. The stir of their advent would, he knew, bring plenty of the neighbors flocking to see what was up, and there would be no lack of letterard lads to side with him. What did cause him some uneasiness was the doubt whether any party would actually come. His appeal might have been disregarded. The Rathbag farmers might be too busy for such expeditions, or they might know enough about letterard affairs to be aware that there was in reality no talk of evicting Felix Moriarty, and so perceive the hoax. For this reason Johnny kept his own counsel, lest the failure of his joke should raise the laugh on him. But while the sunset was still unfurling in the west a wide fan of pinked flush feathery cloudlets, which seemed to be waving off a misty little moon, like a white rose leaf fluttering up out of the faint green east, Johnny's fears were dispersed by what he deemed a very joyful sight. From his coign of vantage he espied coming up the lane something which he presently ascertained to be a troop of men, several among whom carried scythes or sickles, and, more than this, along with them moved a brilliant blue and scarlet object drawn by a pair of horses. "Glory be if it isn't a mowing machine they're after bringin'," he said in high delight. "Well now, that bangs Banagher," and he laughed so uncircumspectly that he almost lost his footing on the slope of Moriarty's thatch, to which he had mounted. A mowing machine it was, the fact being that Theg Ahern, the orator, in the absence of his elder brother, a well-to-do farmer, had taken upon himself, contrary to advice, to borrow it for the demonstration against the evictors. End of section 32, read by GERALD MOE, Tucker, Georgia. Section 33 of By Beach and Bog-Land, Some Irish Stories by Jane Barlow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Moriarty's Meadow, Part 2. With his torn straw hat flapping in the gusty breeze, Johnny stood up tall beside his dumpy haycock and surveyed the approach of the cavalcade, smiling his broadest smile. But there were no smiles on the faces that looked up at him. The party from Rathbeg were by this time distinctly out of humor. They had failed to get any satisfactory information about Moriarty's Meadow from the following of unoccupied gossoons whom their progress had attracted, and this led them to apprehend that they had somehow blundered about the road. No suspicion of a trick had as yet occurred to them, but they were not by any means in a mood to take one in good part. Therefore, when Johnny, grinning more broadly than ever, replied to inquiries, "Is it Moriarty's Meadow you was looking for?" "Sure, ampt I meself, standing on it before your eyes. And a grand big one it is, only I don't know will yous find it very handy, driving your pair-horse yoke into it. Maybe it's lucky I done the mowin' meself." His answer evolved looks and language sufficiently threatening to make him glance round rapidly, singling out the friendly faces as he took a firmer grip of the sturdy blackthorn which he had providently hidden behind the haycock. An excited parley ensued, growing momentarily angrier and louder, while Farmer Ahern's fiery chestnuts fumed and fidgeted, spurning the rough road and flashing the set blades of their machine in restless starts to and fro. Then, on a brief pause, a voice rose clear and shrill. It proceeded from little Dan Malloy, who had perched himself on a wall adjoining the cabin, and it said, "Sure now, if he's so fond of mowin'," Dan pointed to Johnny, "mightn't you take your fine yoke in there?" He pointed across to the open gate of Johnny's oat field, "and give it a turn through his bit of oats." This suggestion, which was received with an assenting laugh, roused acute horror in Johnny. Such peril did it threaten to his thriving crop, the very core of his hope and pride. Down he hurled himself with a clatter to prevent the outrage, aiming, as he passed, at the mischievous visage of Dan Malloy a resentful cuff, which Dan adroitly ducked. But Johnny's action only precipitated the event he was dreading, for the restless horses, scared by his abrupt rush towards their heads, broke away from all control and bolted straight into the field. Alas for the lovely young oats, as 4 pairs of galloping hoofs and a pair of wide-rimmed iron wheels burst wildly into them, followed by a throng of trampling feet which wrought hardly less grievous havoc. Every moment was destroying among the soft green blades and hellums with their silken ears the work of many days' sunshine and dewy air, when suddenly, before the careening runaways had been brought to a standstill, another yet more alarming object diverted the attention of their pursuers. Johnny's reserve on the subject of his jest had known one exception, very unfortunately for his confidant's peace of mind. She was his mother, a little old widow woman, prematurely aged and crippled by rheumatism, so that she had to be carried to and fro between her bed and her armchair, her only journeys. Her son Johnny was most kind to her. It had been with the best intentions that he enlivened their morning meal by telling her all about the grand trick he had just played on the Rathbeg lads, and how infuriated they would be when they landed over with their scythes to cut nothing good or bad, and what a laugh it would raise on them, and what a splendid row was certain to follow. It's much, he said, if somebody's head isn't broke over it. And then he had gone off whistling in the highest spirits, leaving little Mrs. Quinn a prey to the blackest forebodings. All the long, lonely day she brooded uninterruptedly upon the dreadful possibilities of the coming encounter, in which crooked, shining scythe blades, wielded by rash and wrathful hands, might play a part as fatal as if they were flashes from a murky cloud. They'll be murderin' one another up there, she said to herself, and me sittin' here all the while like an old tabby cat in comfort by the chimney corner, and no abler to do a hand's turn agin it. Johnny's fear that nobody might come formed her sole hope, and of that she was bereft about the pink sunset time, when little Joe O'Hay ran in to her with a jug of sour milk and the news that he had just seen a great lot of men carrying scythes and a quare big yoke of a mowing machine going along up the lane towards Felix Moriarty's. At these tidings Mrs. Quinn's heart sank. Then her mind swiftly caught at and grasped a desperate resolution. "Joe, sonny," she said to Joe, who was on the point of racing off for another view of the remarkable machine, "do you see that bucket of water?" It was a zinc bucket set brim full near the door. "I want you," she continued, "to take a couple of standing leps in the middle of it." "But sure, ma'am, wouldn't I be splashing it all over the floor and drownding everything?" Joe objected, amazed. "Never you mind, sonny. Do as I bid you like a good boy. Lep away, and I'll give you a penny," said Mrs. Quinn, whereupon Joe, although still puzzled, by no means loth, did jump so energetically that the contents of the bucket were speedily dispersed in sparkling showers, a bountiful share of which thoroughly drenched his own garments. "That's an illigant child," Mrs. Quinn said approvingly. "Ne'er a dry stitch there's on you at all. Now come here till I tell you what else I'm wanting you to do. You know, Joey, it's a terrible wicked thing," she went on impressively, as he stood by her, dripping and expectant. "It's a terrible, wicked, dangerous thing for childer to get meddlin' with the fire." "I don't ever meddle with it," Joe hastened to protest. "Biddy and Paddy does be at it of an odd while, and I do be bidding them let it alone and not be burning themselves up." "To be sure, Vic, to be sure, so you would. But now, just for this very once, and you're to not ever go do such a thing again at all in the length of your life's days, I want you, may goodness forgive me, to take the little matchbox you'll find behind the blue jug on the dresser and run out to the back of the house, where you can aisy reach to the thatch from the high bank of the field, and strike a few of the blue heads of the matches, Jewel, on the rough side of the box. Och, but I'm the old sinner, and stick them lightin' into the thatch here and there, as if you was sticking pins in a pincushion, and you'll see the fine flare-up there'll be directly. It's as dry as tinder." This commission was surprisingly to the taste of 6-year-old Joe. "And what more'll I do after that, ma'am?" he said, eager for further agreeable instructions. "There's the pigsty. Sure, then, you might be running up the field and screeching fire and thieves and all manner," said Mrs. Quinn. "It's a sort of game, you see." But as Joe gleefully darted out, armed with the small yellow box, she shook her head stiffly. "Och, now meself's the wicked old woman, but 'deed it's murdering themselves they'd be, and Johnny. And if I sent them only a message," she argued, Sure, they might be apt to think the crother was romancin' and just keep on fightin'. But seein's believin', and the child's drippin' wet, for by his clothes bein' woolen every thread. He couldn't set himself alight anyhow. May goodness forgive me. It's killin' me his poor mother had a right to be, for puttin' such divilment in the crother's head. So we can easily understand how it came to pass that in the midst of chasing the driverless mowing machine, several people became aware of a thick smoke column rising on the edge of the slope below them, and of red flames shooting up through the blue cloud, growing rapidly stronger and brighter in the faded daylight. At the same time, they observed a small figure rushing about with shrill shrieks in the adjacent field. Joe, in fact, had been so much scared by the sudden huge blaze of the dry thatch that he performed his screaming lustily. Among the first to see was Johnny Quinn. "Mercy around," he said, "there's our house blazin' wild, and herself inside it." He outstripped all the others in their rush downhill, and reached the scene of the conflagration none too soon, for the kitchen was a smother of smoke, through which wisps of fiery straw had already begun to drop fiercely about the helpless old woman, as she sat distracted by conflicting terrors. She could hardly realize her relief when she found herself where she could breathe and see, and in the arms of her Johnny, safe and sound. Nevertheless, the mother and son spent that night uncomfortably enough, huddled in a corner of their devastated dwelling, under an extemporized shelter of potato sacks, while all around them hummed and plashed through their charred rafters the drops of a downpour which had arrived just too late to save their roof. Johnny sat in mournful meditation. "Well, now," he said at last, "it's quare bad luck. There's me oats destroyed, that was grand, and the machine smashed, and the horse's leg cut woeful, and our bit of good thatch ruinated over our heads, and all would intendin' a joke." "It's on your knees you ought to be, me lad," said Mrs. Quinn, the incendiary, "thanking goodness that the feet of you aren't raped off with them aegis-slashing scythes, and meself not burned into ashes and cinders, scheming to prevent you's doing murder, instead of talking about bad luck." But Johnny's gratitude remained undemonstrative. "I'm thinking," he said, "it's a fool's work to be raising a laugh on any people, for you never can rightly tell what else mayn't take and rise up along with it. Ay, bedad, and apter than not, something you won't like." End of section 33, read by GERALD MOE, Tucker, Georgia. Section 34 of By Beach and Bog-Land, Some Irish Stories by Jane Barlow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Delayed in transmission. When anybody in Meadow Clochran gives a party, the word which goes round to bid the neighbours often has far to travel over the wide bog-land, and is conveyed by very miscellaneous messengers, all manner of wayfarers being pressed into the service. This was especially often the case with the Nolans and the Minulties, two of the most sociably disposed families in the place, and living remotely at opposite ends of the spacious and lonesome Craiganmore bog. Both households, however, comprised lively young people, while both were a shade or so more prosperous in their farming than is common in that district, and owned the warmest hearths and the widest floors. Consequently, among circumstances thus propitious, it was not likely that the obstacles merely of long miles and rough walking would prove insuperable when either wished to let the other know there would be dancing in it on such or such a night. As they were on most friendly terms, they of course took care that the dates of their entertainments should not clash, but everybody knows how difficult it occasionally is to prevent this, and not long ago, by a chapter of those accidents which will sometimes happen, Denny Breen and John Hickey met on Tackaberry's Bridge, Denny charged with an invitation from the Nolans to the Minulties, and John with one from the Minulties to the Nolans, both for the same Saturday evening. Tackaberry's Bridge is about halfway between the two white farmhouses, humping itself up in an abrupt, ungainly loop like a travelling caterpillar over the Myrna River, which flows through the middle of the bog. Though roughly built, it shows more traces of design, such as it is, than the rest of the road, which seems just a track worn by feet choosing the firmest ground as they go to and fro. Stepping stones occur here and there, and are found convenient by pedestrians in soft weather, but naturally tend to discourage any other kind of traffic. As Denny Breen sat now on the low parapet under the only little tree, a stooping willow, visible far and wide, he looked down into the clear brown water and said, if the both of them has company axed for the one night, it stands to reason that neither of them could be going out in any case. So there's no great good in me tramping on all the way to the Minulties. There is not, bedad, said John Hickey, nor in meself, for the matter of that, to be mindin' about lavin' word with the Nolans. Because, said Denny, this is a very handy day to be borryin' the gun off Pat Kelly when we have the dogs along, and the police are away with themselves to Loughnaglee petty sessions. A race is runnin' on the whole of them. True for you, they are so bedad, said John. The last named consideration was an important one, owing to the fact that neither the proposed borrowers nor lender happened to possess a license, which made immunity from the chance of encounters with inquisitive patrols appear a highly desirable feature in an afternoon's sport. Accordingly, the opportunity was pronounced too good to be thrown away, and the two faithless youths were soon happily engaged among bog-holes and tussocks, and heathery boulders, and golden burning furze bushes, with no further thought of the Nolans or Minoltis. Anyone whose experience has lain in places like Loughnaglee will understand how improbably large an amount of good luck would be needed to keep the news of an entertainment from the ears of an uninvited neighbor. No such exceptional quantity intervened on this occasion. Very little contrariness of things, on the other hand, commonly suffices to ensure the worst possible complexion being put on the matter, and that was now amply supplied. A few unfortunate remarks from tactless or ill-disposed acquaintances, a few slight misrepresentations, inadvertent or otherwise, and the thing was done. The seeds of offence were safely sown and might be trusted to thrive apace. Only a short growing space was wanted to ripen the conviction alike of Nolans and Minoltis that they had been treated by each other with black ingratitude, if not insulted outrageously, and their firm belief in their wrongs was supersaturated with bitterness. The mood of that goddess excluded from the wedding feast, or of that fairy forgotten at the christening, may well have been enviable in comparison, since all the world has heard tell how they gave expression to their resentment with a satisfactory thoroughness far beyond the reach of any little farming folk looking as sulky as a pig at one another on a lonely Donegal bog. Although the latter had certainly no wish to conceal their state of mind, pride forbade them to manifest it in public by utterances more explicit than enigmatical innuendos, coupled with the cast of countenance aforesaid, and this helped to keep the origin of the grievance in obscurity, thereby lessening the chances of an explanation. Consequently, before many weeks went by, all Loughnaglee had begun to remark with interest that Nolans and Minoltis weren't so very great these times, whatever ailed them, and soon afterwards it became clear that they were black out altogether. The estrangement may perhaps have gratified 2 or 3 mischief-makers. It undoubtedly caused much distress to more than one of the persons most concerned. Generally speaking, it was regarded as an inconvenient and untoward occurrence, and if it had made a newspaper paragraph, might have been said with more than average truth to have thrown a gloom over the whole parish. On nobody, however, did it produce less effect than on the pair who had brought it about. Denny Breen and John Hickey, being but slightly acquainted with either of the fronted parties, and finding their chief pleasure in the company of their terriers stravating over the hills and bogs, were equally ignorant and unconcerned about this detail in the social affairs of their neighborhood. They might have stated accurately that it was all one to them so long as they could be getting after the rabbits and birds and troutses. But as the autumn waned into winter, diminishing their opportunities for those favorite pursuits, they found themselves impelled to devise other pastimes. And one tedious morning in Christmas week, said Dinny to John, "D'ye mind the day a while ago you and me was bringing round word of a party to Nolan's and Minulty's, and divil a bit of it we brought them at all?" "I do so, bedad," said John. "That was the time we got the 3 brace of snipe up at the end of the low, and took them home along with the rabbits sittin' in the middle of 2 big loads of bracken, and me hero of war at the barracks." He referred to the police sergeant looking over the gate at us and we going by. "Because," said Dinny, "I was thinking, why wouldn't we be bringing it to them now? Better late than never, as the man said when he ate the bad egg. We needn't be telling them what Saturday it was, so they'll never suppose but it's the next. That's St. Stephen's Day. I'd like to see what old Anastasia Minulty would say to it. There's apt to be some quare talk out of her, for Mick Gahan was telling me she's ragin' mad agin all the Nolans this while back, whatever's took her. Looking as bitter as soot at one another they are this long time, sure enough. Troth now, I wouldn't wonder if the whole pack of them would be leppin' over it," John said hopefully. "I'm passin' by Nolan's place this evening, and I could as easy as not look in." "And I'll leg it over to the Minultys," said Dinny, "for I might as well be doing one thing as another." The 2 friends executed their design without difficulty, but, so far as John Hickey was concerned, with somewhat disappointing results. For when he put his head in at the Nolans' back door, he saw nobody except Mrs. Peter rolling out a flour cake on the table, and in reply to his communication, all she said was, "Musha, I hope they're well," with an air of the utmost composure. Then to his inquiry whether he should convey and answer for her, she rejoined simply and placidly, "Ah, go and fish," so that he retired with a sense of failure. Denny Breen's adventures were more interesting, as he found at home Mrs. Anastasia Minulty, who received his misleading message with a tirade which almost came up to his expectations in vehemence and vigor. She ended an impassioned critique upon the characters and conduct of the Nolan family, past and present, by requesting him to tell them from her that unless they kept their impudence to themselves, they would be very apt to get it back, along with something they might happen not to like, which Dinny solemnly promised to do. Whereupon, as he was passing the Haggart gate, out after him sped Molly Minulty, who must have been running along the other side of the dike on purpose to intercept him, and who breathlessly explained that he needn't repeat e'er a word her grandmother was after saying, for she'd seemed in a quare cross humour the whole day, and didn't mane anything at all, good or bad. So Dinny more honestly pledged himself on no account to deliver Mrs. Minulty's refusal. Now these things would scarcely have helped the most acute and furthest sighted to predict what did actually happen on that next Saturday evening, or to account for it with any certainty. Who, indeed, can say how it came about? But whether through the genial influence of the season, or a limited choice of gaieties, through amity or ennui, libe oder langeweile, the fact is that in a moonless obscurity between 7 and 8 o'clock, 2 parties of people, coming from opposite directions, rushed almost into one another's arms on Tackaberry's Bridge as they fled towards the willow tree for shelter from a shower of rattling hailstones. "Musha, good gracious, and is it yourself, Mrs. Minolte, ma'am?" said Julia Nolan, becoming aware of whom she had jostled against. "Maybe it's too soon we are, then, steppin' over to your place." "Pater Nolan, begorra, I didn't expect to see you till we got to the farm," said Art Minolte. "And what way at all are you facin' the now?" Meanwhile, Peter's eldest son was shaking hands interminably with Art's youngest daughter, and saying, "And how's yourself this long time, Molly Ashtor? Sure I haven't seen a sight of you for a month of Sundays." "Somebody's after making fools of us, that's the truth," declared Joe Minolte, when facts had been stated. "And a dale our best plan, then," said Peter Nolan, "is to not be made fools of. Just step along home wid us, the whole of yous, the way you was intendin', and 'twill be a comical thing if we can't get a drop out of the bottle and a scrape off of the fiddle handy enough." Well and good, as the old Shanachis say. Peter's suggestion was unanimously adopted, and since shortly afterwards the neighbors were not only remarking how Minoltes and Nolans had patched it up, but were also agreeably excited by the prospect of young Peter Nolan and Molly Minolte getting married at the Shrove, we may perhaps regard the results of this second misdeed on the part of Dinny and John as an exception to the rule that 2 wrongs don't make a right. Still, by way of a better moral, we should bear in mind that only for the opportune clatter of the hail shower the consequences would probably have been widely different. For if the 2 families had passed each other by unbeknownst in the dark, to arrive cold and wet at empty shut-up houses, it is hard to say what complications might not have ensued. The chances certainly are that no such wedding would have taken place at the Shrovetide, if indeed it had not been put off hopelessly for ever and a day. So great are the perils that environ practical jokers and their victims. End of section 34, read by GERALD MOE, Tucker, Georgia. Section 35 of By Beach and Bog-Land, Some Irish Stories by Jane Barlow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. For company. Larry Behan, stepping over from Logmore to Clochranbeg, a few perches short of the Silver Lane, met with Joe Hedican leading his sorrel mare, and said to him, "What at all ails you?" "Is it what ails us?" said Joe. "Sure, what else?" said Larry, "and the mare in a lather and a trimble, and yourself comin' along as unsteady as a thing on wires, lookin' fit to drop down of a hape together, the two of yous are." "And why wouldn't we have a right to be," said Joe, "and ourselves just after beholdin' what we won't either of us be the better for till the day we're waked? Bedad then, that same's the pleasant talk for me to be hearin', with the light darkenin' before me every minute," said Larry, "and so it's wakin' the old mare you'll be one of these days, says you. Well now, I niver heard the like of that. But, to be sure, I'm not very long in the County Donegal. I hope you'll send me word of the buryin', for I'd be sorry to miss it. 'Tis the comical notion, if you come to consider it." He laughed, upon consideration, with much noise, at any rate, but as the mare rolled her eyes wildly at him, and Joe only shook his head the more ominously, he withdrew abruptly from their unsympathetic countenances, though he persisted in his guffaw. When he had gone half a dozen yards, he faced round and shouted, "Might you happen to know, is the Garvey's boat in yet?" Joe, however, was just mounting, and he plunged off at full speed without seeming to hear. "Fine flounderin' and bouncin' about he has, and be hanged to him, himself and his old baste," Larry said with indignation. "If I thought the Garveys were like to be stoppin' out late, I'd lave it till tomorrow, and turn back now, but I couldn't tell I mightn't lose the job altogether with delayin'." This was not the risk he chose to run, and he presently reached the entrance of the high-banked, winding boreen, whence he threw a look backwards in hopes that some fellow travellers might be catching him up. Nothing, however, moved on the lonely moorland road behind him, except the gallop of Joe Hedican's horse hurling itself in the wrong direction. So he went forward without the prospect of any company. The Silver Lane twists through an undulating sea of softly heaped up mounds, scantily clad with bent grass, pale and dry, and dark, harsh-textured furzes. These are rooted in almost pure sand, silvery-hued, yet under strong sunbeams, yielding dim golden glimmers that give a faint purple to the shadow in its curves and folds. But the touch of this March evening's twilight left it all cold, white, and grey. It lies deep and powdery on the narrow roadway, so that a man has not even the sound of his own footsteps to reassure him, should he be disposed to feel lonesome and apprehensive. Larry Behan was feeling both as he passed the second sharp turn of the lane and came to a place where a crevice-like path pierced the sand-hill on his left. Here he noticed several huge hoof-prints, some of them impressed with violence upon the low buttresses and ledges of the banks, which, in the ordinary course of things, no horse would have trodden. "Hereabouts it is they seen whatever it was frighted them," he said to himself, and set the mare prancin' and dancin'. 'Twas the quare capers she had, between us and harm, look where she flounced right across the road and scraped herself up agin the furze bush. Her hair's thick on it. He was hastening on, longing and dreading to be round the next corner, when he heard close by a sound, such a homely, commonplace one, that he experienced hardly a moment of panic before out of the little bypath ran a very small boy, swinging a large tin can. As a general rule, Larry would have seen nothing particularly attractive about the black-headed, barefooted, flannel-petticoated gossoon, and would probably have allowed him to pass on unaccosted. But in the present circumstances he could have desired no better company, for an innocent child is the most efficacious safeguard possible when uncanny things are about. Another encouraging reflection also occurred to him immediately. 'Twas that now, and divil a thing else, scared the two of them, the little brat skitin' by, clatterin' his can, and the light shinin' off it on a suddent. Still, this view of the matter, though plausible and rational, was not quite certain enough to justify him in letting slip the chance of an escort, and he therefore set about engaging the child in conversation. He did so rather clumsily, for lack of the familiarity with children's society, which would have enabled him to fill up the gap between 30-odd and 5 years old with appropriate small talk. "Is it goin' for water you was, sonny?" he said. "She sent me to the well again," said the gossoon, stopping his trot and pointing up the little path to a tangle of briars and long grass in a slight hollow. "And is it gone dry on you?" said Larry, looking into the empty can. The reply was a turning of it upside down to show a crack that ran for several inches round the bottom rim. "I can put the top of me littlest finger right through it," the gossoon said and proved. "It won't hold e'er a sup at all, and the big jug's broke too." "That's a bad job," said Larry. "There's nothing she can be sendin' now, unless the black kettle itself. That's as much as I can do to lift when it's empty inside, let alone full. It's the size of meself, bedad," averred Larry's protector. "Sure, then, she couldn't ax you to be carryin' that." "Is it far you come?" Larry inquired with some anxiety. "I dunno," said the gossoon, "but it's a terrible old baste of a big kettle for always wantin' to be filled. I hate the sight of it sittin' there on the fire, with the dirty old sooty lid tryin' to lep off it, and then herself does be bawlin' to me to run out again and bring the water before it's boiled dry. I do be sick and tired of goin' up the lane with the heavy can pullin' out the arm of me all the way back, fit to destroy me, Catty Loughnaglee says it is. And a while ago I was givin' it a couple of clumps agin a stone, where I seen a weeny crack comin', so maybe that's what beginned it. But you needn't let on, or I'll be kilt. Sorra a sup it'll hold." He dropped some small handfuls of the fine sand into the can, and holding it up, watched the grains sift slowly out. This experiment he repeated more than once, and Larry, albeit in a hurry, looked on with prudent patience. But at last he suggested Mightn't she be mad if you're too long delayin'?" "She does be mad most whiles," his companion said philosophically, "and I don't so much mind if she won't be sendin' me back wid the ugly old kettle." However, he began to walk on, rattling a couple of cockle shells that had remained in the can. Larry kept close beside him and meekly waited when he occasionally stopped to pick up pebbles, or explore rabbit holes, or start sand avalanches and cascades by tugging at the colorless roots of the grasses in the slithery banks. It was a slow progress, and the dusk had grown perceptibly grayer by the time that Larry emerged from between them at a place where the road branches on the right towards Clochran-Beg, on the left towards the great bog of Graylish. "And what way are you going, Vic?" Larry inquired with less anxiety now, having left behind the Silver Lane, which he knew to be the most perilous stage of his journey. The child pointed to a small cabin standing opposite, a stone's throw back from the road, a reply that somewhat surprised Larry, for even through the gathering dimness the place looked quite ruinous and deserted, with rifted roof and rank weeds peering in at frameless windows. "She's screechin' to me," said the gossoon, and darted off, making for the door. Larry heard nothing but the cockle shells clattering in the can. "There's no sort of people," he said to himself, "would be livin' in the likes of that, unless it was tinkers stoppin' a while. But I see ne'er a sign of an ass or a cart in it." Well now, he was the quare little imp, himself and the big kettle. A bit further on he overtook the widow Nolan, who was going his way, and as they walked along together, he casually asked of her how the Silver Lane had come by its bad name. "For," he said, "since I'm in this parish, I met wid many that do be afeard of it, but what's wrong wid it I never happened to hear tell." "Sure it was before my time," said Mrs. Nolan. "There used to be a woman livin' in the old empty house you seen at this end of it, and a little boy belongin' to her that she gave bad treatment to. Huntin' him off she was continual to fetch her in big cans full of water out of the well up near the far end of the lane that you might be noticin' goin' by. So one day she sent him with a great heavy lump of a kettle he couldn't rightly lift, and tryin' to fill it, the crother overbalanced himself and fell in after his head, and was got dead drowned. And ever since then it does be walkin' there now and again, and folks say there's no worser bad luck goin' than for a body to see a sight of it, or to so much as hear the clink of the can. Well, man alive, what's took you at all?" "The Lord have mercy on me this day," said Larry, "and meself just after walking alongside of it and talking to it the length of the boreen." And thenceforward neither of them had any breath to spare for conversation until they at last reached distant, still cruelly distant, Clochran-Beg. The end. End of section 35, read by GERALD MOE, Tucker, Georgia. End of by Beach and Bog-Land, Some Irish Stories by Jane Barlow.